My name is Chloe. I am 28 years old, and I work as a bookkeeper for a small logistics firm in Columbus, Ohio. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting at my parents' dining room table for what was supposed to be a belated birthday dinner. I dropped my napkin, and when I bent down to pick it up, I saw my mother's reflection in the sliding glass patio door. I watched her hand hover over my iced water. I watched her drop a crushed white pill into my drink. A pill meant to silence me. Before I could even react, before I could accidentally knock the glass over, my older sister snatched it right out of my hand. She laughed that loud, arrogant laugh of hers and said, "Still afraid of Mom's tap water?" Then she drank the whole thing down. She had no idea that just one sip was about to expose the darkest secret our family had ever hidden. Before I tell you exactly what happened when that pill kicked in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy stories about justice and standing up for yourself. Also, let me know in the comments where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. I love reading your responses. Now let me take you back to the beginning of that night. I had not wanted to go to dinner that night. Growing up in the suburban comfort of Columbus, my family was the kind that cared more about how things looked from the street than how they felt inside the house. My father, Thomas, was a man who hid behind his newspaper and his golf club memberships. My mother, Barbara, managed our family's public image with a ruthless iron grip. We were the perfect church-going family. At least that is what the neighbors thought. But inside those walls, love was a currency, and I was perpetually bankrupt. My older sister, Jessica, was the golden child. At 30 years old, she had my mother's perfect blonde hair, an effortless social grace, and a lifestyle funded entirely by my parents and her husband, Bradley. Bradley was a slick finance guy who drove a leased Porsche and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. I, on the other hand, was just Chloe, the quiet one, the reliable one, the invisible bookkeeper who lived in a modest apartment and drove a 10-year-old sedan. Whenever Jessica overspent her credit cards, I was the one who quietly sat down with my parents' budget to figure out how they could bail her out. Whenever there was a family crisis, a logistical nightmare, or a mess to clean up, I was the designated maid. But when it came time for celebrations, I faded into the wallpaper. My 28th birthday had passed 3 weeks prior, with nothing more than a generic text message from my father. So when my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon and invited me over for a special make-up birthday dinner, every instinct in my body told me to say no. Barbara's voice on the phone had been unnaturally sweet. She told me she felt terrible about missing my actual birthday and wanted to reconnect just the family, a nice quiet evening to celebrate me. I should have known better. But there is a stubborn, foolish part of every unloved child that still hopes, even in their late 20s, that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time they will finally see me. I put on a nice navy blouse, bought a bottle of wine I could barely afford, and drove to their 4-bedroom colonial house in the suburbs. When I walked through the front door, the smell of roasted lamb and garlic filled the air. It felt like a trap dressed up as a holiday. My father greeted me with a stiff pat on the shoulder before immediately returning to the television in the living room. Jessica and Bradley arrived 20 minutes late, bursting through the door in a cloud of expensive perfume and loud complaints about traffic. Jessica did not even say happy birthday to me. She just handed her coat to my mother and immediately launched into a story about a miserable spa day she had endured that morning. I quietly took my seat at the dining room table, placing myself in the same chair I had sat in since childhood, the one closest to the kitchen door, so I could easily get up to fetch extra napkins or clear the plates. The dining room was formal, suffocatingly so. Heavy mahogany furniture, a crystal chandelier that cast harsh shadows across the table, and a large sliding glass patio door directly behind my mother's chair. As the dinner progressed, the conversation flowed exactly as it always did. It flowed completely around me. Bradley dominated the room, bragging about his latest golf handicap and a massive, vague corporate merger he was supposedly handling. My mother hung on his every word, pouring him expensive red wine and praising his business acumen. Jessica complained about her personal trainer and showed off a new diamond tennis bracelet Bradley had bought her. I sat there cutting my lamb, chewing silently, completely ignored at my own belated birthday dinner. I watched them perform their wealth. I knew for a fact, because of my bookkeeping background, that my parents were drowning in debt. I knew their credit cards were maxed. I knew Bradley's firm had recently laid off half its staff. But in this dining room, they were royalty, and I was the peasant allowed to sit at the end of their table. The tension in the room was thick, layered with a strange, frantic energy. My mother's eyes kept darting toward me. She was overly attentive in a way that made my skin crawl. She asked me twice if I wanted a different wine. She insisted I try the side dishes. It was a bizarre, suffocating performance. About 40 minutes into the meal, the heavy atmosphere became almost unbearable. Bradley was in the middle of a loud story about a client he had intimidated, and Jessica was laughing shrilly. I felt a sudden, desperate need to ground myself to just take a breath away from their suffocating presence. I reached for my water glass, my hand trembling slightly from the sheer anxiety of being in that room. In doing so, I bumped my fork, and my white cloth napkin slipped off my lap, fluttering silently to the hardwood floor. "Excuse me," I murmured, though no one was listening to me anyway. I pushed my chair back slightly and bent down under the heavy mahogany table. The air down there was cooler, away from the heat of the chandelier and their suffocating egos. I reached for the napkin, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I lingered for just a second, closing my eyes, telling myself I only had to endure this for another hour before I could go back to my quiet, safe apartment. When I opened my eyes and grabbed the cloth, I happened to glance up before raising my head above the table level. From my vantage point under the table, I had a clear line of sight to the large sliding glass patio door directly behind my mother. The darkness of the backyard turned the glass into a perfect, flawless mirror. In that reflection, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. My mother was sitting straight up, but her hands were busy. She had pulled a small folded tissue from the pocket of her cardigan. I watched the reflection in the glass as she carefully unfolded it. Inside was a crushed white powder. I held my breath, my body paralyzing entirely, as I watched her hand hover directly over my tall glass of iced water. With a swift, practiced motion, she tipped the powder into my drink. I saw it dissolve instantly into the ice and clear liquid. Then she casually picked up her own wine glass and took a sip, turning her attention back to Bradley's story, as if she had not just committed a severe crime right in front of her family. Down under the table, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mind raced in 1,000 directions at once. A pill. She had just spiked my drink. What was it? A sedative? A sleeping pill? A psychiatric drug? Why would my own mother want to drug me at the dinner table? The sheer terror of the moment threatened to overwhelm me, but years of being the family problem solver, years of navigating their toxicity and doing the math on their lies kicked in. A cold, hard survival instinct took over. I knew I could not scream. I could not confront her. If I yelled that she had poisoned my water, they would deny it. My father would call me hysterical. Jessica would mock me. Bradley would laugh. My mother would look at me with faux concern and say I was having a mental breakdown. They would use my outburst against me. I had to destroy the evidence naturally. I had to spill the glass. I took one more deep breath, gripping the cloth napkin so tightly my knuckles turned white. I slowly rose back up from under the table, forcing my face into a mask of total boredom. My eyes immediately locked onto my water glass. It looked exactly the same. The ice clinked gently against the rim. The condensation dripped down the sides. There was no trace of the white powder she had just dumped into it. My mother turned to me, a sickeningly sweet smile stretching across her face. "Is everything all right, Chloe? You look a little pale. You really should drink some water, honey. Keep yourself hydrated." Her words sent a chill straight down my spine. She wanted me to drink it right now. She was waiting for it. "I'm fine, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I reached out with my right hand, extending my fingers toward the glass. My plan was simple. I would grab it clumsily, knock the rim against my plate, and send the poisoned water spilling all over the mahogany table and the expensive rug. I would apologize profusely, clean it up, and demand to go home. I was inches away. My fingertips just grazed the cold, wet glass. But I forgot to account for Jessica. Jessica, who had spent her entire 30 years of life demanding that she be the center of attention. Jessica, who could not stand that our mother was looking at me, speaking to me, expressing concern for me, even if it was completely fake. Before my fingers could close around the glass, A manicured hand with perfectly painted red nails swooped across the table. Jessica snatched the glass right out from under my fingertips. "Oh, please," Jessica scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "She's always so dramatic. Are you still afraid of Mom's tap water, Chloe? You know we don't have a water filter here. Are you too good for our water now?" "Jessica, wait," I blurted out, my voice cracking with sudden panic. "Don't be so stingy." Jessica laughed loudly, throwing her head back. It was that arrogant, condescending laugh that had echoed through my entire childhood. She brought the glass to her lips. My mother's head snapped around. Her eyes went wide, absolute horror flashing across her face. "Jessica, no! Put that down!" Barbara screamed, her voice losing every ounce of its sweet, controlled tone. But she was too late. Jessica, driven by pure spite and the desire to belittle me, tipped the glass back and chugged half the water in 3 massive gulps. She slammed the glass back down on the table, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, a triumphant smirk on her face. "See," Jessica mocked, looking directly at me. "Perfectly fine. You're such a weirdo, Chloe." I sat frozen in my chair. The dining room plunged into a suffocating, terrifying silence. My father looked confused, lowering his wine glass. Bradley was frowning, clearly annoyed that his story had been interrupted. But my mother looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her face was chalk white. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her fingers trembled. She stared at Jessica, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, sheer panic radiating from every pore of her body. I looked at the half-empty glass of water sitting on the table. Then I looked at my older sister, who was still smirking, completely unaware of what she had just done. I did not know exactly what my mother had put in that glass, but as I sat there watching the heavy silence stretch across the dining room, a dark, terrifying realization settled into my bones. The trap they had carefully laid for me had just snapped shut on their favorite daughter. And whatever was about to happen next, it was going to tear this entire family apart. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my entire life. I sat perfectly still in my chair at the end of the table. I focused on cutting a small piece of roasted lamb, moving my knife and fork with careful, deliberate motions. Inside, my mind was screaming. I watched my older sister out of the corner of my eye. Jessica was still smirking, still leaning into her husband Bradley, completely oblivious to the poison currently making its way through her bloodstream. Bradley continued to boast about his golf game and his corporate mergers. He did not notice anything wrong. My father Thomas was staring at the television in the other room, completely checked out of the family dinner as usual. But my mother was falling apart right in front of me. Barbara sat rigid in her high-backed mahogany chair. The color had completely drained from her face. Her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looked like a mask sitting on top of pale, terrified skin. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to put her wine glass down on the table. She kept staring at Jessica, her eyes wide with a frantic, helpless terror. She wanted to scream. I could see it in her throat. She wanted to yell for someone to help, to force Jessica to spit the water out, to do something to stop what was coming. But she could not say a single word. If she spoke up, she would have to explain why a simple glass of tap water was dangerous. She would have to confess to her golden child, to her wealthy son-in-law, and to my oblivious father, that she had just tried to drug her youngest daughter. So she sat there trapped in her own wicked silence, watching her favorite child absorb the blow meant for me. It started exactly 14 minutes after Jessica emptied the glass. Jessica was in the middle of complaining about a receptionist at her country club. She was waving her fork around to make a point. Suddenly, her hand stopped in midair. The fork slipped from her manicured fingers and clattered loudly onto her porcelain plate. Bradley stopped talking and looked at her. Jessica blinked several times, her eyelids drooping heavily. She opened her mouth to finish her sentence, but the words came out thick and slurred. She sounded like she had been drinking heavily for hours, even though she had only had 1 glass of wine. Bradley let out a short, uncomfortable laugh. He asked her if she was feeling all right. Jessica tried to turn her head to look at him, but the movement was sluggish and uncoordinated. She mumbled something incomprehensible. Her head lolled to the side. Her eyes rolled back slightly, showing the whites beneath her perfect eyelashes. My mother gasped loudly. She pushed her chair back with such force that it scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. She rushed to Jessica, grabbing her daughter by the shoulders. Barbara was shaking her, calling her name in a voice that was bordering on hysterical. Jessica tried to stand up. I think she wanted to get to the bathroom. She placed her hands flat on the dining table and pushed herself upward. But her legs had completely lost their strength. The drug had taken full control of her nervous system. Jessica stood for half a second before her knees buckled completely. She collapsed forward. Her body went entirely limp, falling like a rag doll. On her way down to the floor, the side of her head slammed violently against the sharp edge of the mahogany dining table. The sickening crack of bone hitting wood echoed through the dining room. Chaos erupted instantly. Jessica crumpled onto the expensive rug, completely unconscious. A small trickle of blood began to pool near her temple where she had hit the table. My mother dropped to her knees beside her golden child, screaming. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure panic. She was crying, shaking Jessica, begging her to wake up. Bradley jumped up from his chair, knocking his wine glass over. The dark red liquid spilled across the white tablecloth, dripping down onto the floor like a horrible omen. He stood there uselessly staring at his unconscious wife, repeating her name over and over again, but doing absolutely nothing to help. The screaming finally snapped my father out of his trance. Thomas rushed into the dining room, his face pale with confusion. He saw his favorite daughter bleeding on the rug, and his wife sobbing hysterically. He immediately pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed 911. I could hear him yelling at the dispatcher, telling them his daughter had suddenly collapsed and hit her head, demanding an ambulance right away. Through all of this, I remained standing near my chair. I did not rush forward. I did not scream. I felt a cold, detached clarity wash over me. I was watching my family panic over a medical emergency that my own mother had orchestrated. In the frantic shuffling, Bradley took a clumsy step backward to get out of my father's way. His expensive leather shoe caught the strap of Jessica's heavy designer handbag, which had been resting on the chair next to hers. The bag toppled over, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Because the clasp was unfastened, the contents spilled out across the floorboards. A makeup bag, a wallet, a pair of sunglasses, and a thick manila folder slid directly toward my feet. Nobody noticed the bag falling. My mother was too busy holding a cloth to Jessica's bleeding forehead. My father was loudly giving the emergency dispatcher their address. Bradley was pacing back and forth near the kitchen door, rubbing the back of his neck in a panic. I looked down at the folder by my feet. It looked entirely out of place among Jessica's luxury items. It was a standard legal file thick with paperwork. The top flap had popped open when it hit the floor, revealing the first few pages of the document inside. I crouched down quietly, pretending I was gathering Jessica's scattered belongings to get them out of the way. I reached for the manila folder. My plan was to just shove the papers back inside and place the bag on a chair. But as my fingers touched the thick paper, my eyes caught the bold black text printed across the top of the first page. The legal heading was unmistakable. Petition for emergency medical conservatorship. My breath hitched in my throat. I stopped moving. I stared at the paper, my eyes frantically scanning the lines of legal jargon. Below the heading was a section identifying the petitioner. The petitioners were listed as Thomas and Barbara, my parents. Below that was the section identifying the proposed ward. The person who was to be stripped of their legal rights, their financial independence, and their freedom. The proposed ward was Chloe. Me. My hands began to tremble as I gently pulled the document out an inch further to read the attached pages. My mind was struggling to process what I was looking at. A conservatorship was a legal tool used for people who were completely incapacitated, people who had dementia or severe brain injuries. I was a perfectly healthy, fully functioning 28-year-old bookkeeper. Why would my family be petitioning a court to take total control of my life? I flipped to the second page. It was an affidavit from a medical professional. The letterhead belonged to a Dr. Evans, a local psychiatrist, whose name I vaguely recognized from my mother's church circle. I read the assessment rapidly. It was entirely fabricated. The doctor claimed to have evaluated me on multiple occasions. The report stated that I was suffering from a severe rapid-onset psychotic break. It claimed I had chronic auditory hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a history of unprovoked violent outbursts. The most chilling part was the final paragraph. The doctor stated under penalty of perjury that I was suffering from severe suicidal delusions and posed an immediate critical danger to myself. The recommendation was an emergency involuntary psychiatric hold in a secure medical facility, followed by a permanent transfer of all my medical and financial rights to my parents. I stared at the forged signature at the bottom of the page. I had never met Dr. Evans in my entire life. I had never had a psychiatric evaluation. I had never experienced a single symptom listed on that horrifying piece of paper. I knelt there on the hardwood floor, clutching the folder as the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying precision. The make-up birthday dinner, the fake kindness, the insistence that I drink my water, the crushed white pill dissolving in the ice. It all made perfect, horrifying sense. The pill was not meant to kill me, it was meant to drug me. It was a powerful sedative or a heavy psychiatric medication. If I had taken that sip within 15 minutes, I would have been the one slurring my words. I would have been the one losing my balance, collapsing onto the floor, unable to speak or defend myself. My parents would have called 911 just as my father was doing right now. But when the paramedics arrived, my mother would have handed them this exact folder. She would have shown them the fake psychiatric evaluation. She would have pointed at my drugged, incoherent body on the floor and told the medics that her severely mentally ill daughter was having a psychotic break and had probably overdosed on something in an attempt to end her own life. They would have strapped me to a stretcher. They would have locked me in a psychiatric ward against my will. And because I would be under the influence of whatever heavy narcotic my mother had slipped into my drink, my confusion and sluggishness would be seen as absolute proof of my mental instability. By the time the drug wore off, my parents would have already taken this petition to a judge. They would have gained total legal control over my life, my finances, and my freedom. I would have been trapped completely powerless, silenced forever. The sheer scale of the betrayal made me feel physically sick. This was not just toxic family behavior. This was a calculated, deeply criminal conspiracy. My mother, my father, my sister, and her husband. They were all in on it. Jessica had the legal folder in her purse. They had planned this together. They had invited me to dinner specifically to execute this trap. But why? Why go to such extreme lengths to destroy my life and lock me away? I was just a bookkeeper. I lived a quiet life. I did not have vast wealth or property. What could they possibly gain by taking control of my non-existent assets? I knew they were in financial trouble, but I had no money for them to steal. There was a missing piece to this puzzle, a massive financial secret that they knew and I did not. The sound of approaching sirens broke through my thoughts. The wailing grew louder, cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The paramedics were almost here. Panic flared in my chest. I had to get out of this house. If they realized I had seen this folder, if my mother realized I knew about the pill, they might try to physically stop me from leaving. They were clearly desperate enough to drug me. I had no idea what else they were capable of doing to keep their secret safe. I quickly shoved the papers back into the manila folder. I stuffed the folder deep into Jessica's designer handbag, burying it under her makeup pouch and wallet. I zipped the bag shut and placed it neatly on the empty chair exactly where it had been before Bradley knocked it over. I stood up, forcing my trembling hands to steady themselves. I smoothed down my navy blouse and took a deep breath, locking all of my terror, all of my rage, and all of my realization behind a mask of perfect, worried innocence. I had to play the part of the invisible, helpless sister one last time. I had to pretend I suspected absolutely nothing. It was the only way I was going to walk out of that front door tonight. The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance illuminated the dining room windows, casting eerie shadows across the spilled wine and the broken glass. My father rushed to open the front door. Heavy footsteps pounded up the porch steps. The paramedics rushed into the dining room carrying their medical bags. My mother stepped back, still sobbing, pointing to Jessica on the floor. I stood in the corner of the room watching the paramedics kneel beside the sister, who had unknowingly saved me from a psychiatric prison. My heart was pounding a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I knew the truth now. My family was trying to destroy me. I had to escape this house, find a lawyer, and figure out what financial secret was worth destroying my life over. The war had just begun, and they had no idea that I was already fighting back. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room lobby hummed with a low, irritating buzz that seemed to vibrate right into my teeth. The waiting area smelled heavily of industrial bleach and stale coffee, a scent that usually brought me a sense of anxiety. But tonight, my anxiety was entirely focused on the woman walking toward me. My mother Barbara moved across the cheap linoleum floor with her usual practiced grace. Even in a hospital waiting room at nearly midnight, she managed to look like she was attending a local charity board meeting. Her posture was rigidly straight, her expression arranged into a mask of mild controlled concern. She sat down in the plastic chair next to mine and placed a perfectly manicured hand over my trembling fingers. I had to force every muscle in my body not to pull away from her touch. She leaned in close, lowering her voice so the triage nurses across the room could not hear us. She told me the doctors had just finished checking Jessica. She said it was nothing serious, just a severe blood sugar drop combined with dehydration. She sighed and shook her head, putting on a flawless performance of a tired but loving mother. She whispered that I knew how Jessica was always starving herself to fit into those expensive country club dresses, and that the wine must have just hit her system too fast. I looked into my mother's bright blue eyes and saw absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating lie. She was gaslighting me right to my face. She knew exactly why her favorite daughter had collapsed. She knew the crushed white powder she had dropped into my iced water was currently shutting down Jessica's nervous system. But Barbara needed to make sure I suspected nothing. She needed to keep me pliant, docile, and completely unaware of the trap they had set for me. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced my face to soften. I channeled 28 years of being the quiet, invisible, eager-to-please daughter. I nodded slowly, letting a look of immense relief wash over my features. I told her I was so glad it was nothing serious. I told her I had been terrified when Jessica hit her head on the mahogany table. I played the naive, worried sister so perfectly that I saw the tension leave my mother's shoulders. Barbara squeezed my hand one last time, completely convinced that I was still her foolish, blind pawn. I knew I had to get out of that hospital immediately. If I stayed, the suffocating proximity to my parents and Bradley would eventually make me crack. I needed space to think, to breathe, and to figure out what the horrifying legal document in Jessica's purse actually meant. I looked at my mother and manufactured a sudden look of realization. I told her that in all the chaos, we had completely forgotten about Jessica and Bradley's golden retriever Buster. I said the dog had been locked in his crate since the afternoon, and someone needed to go to their house, let him out, and feed him. My mother waved her hand dismissively, clearly eager to have me out of the way, so she could manage the hospital narrative without my interference. She told me that was a wonderful idea. She praised me for always being so thoughtful and reliable. The hypocrisy of her words made my stomach churn, but I simply nodded, picked up my purse, and walked out the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. I walked across the damp asphalt of the hospital parking lot toward my 10-year-old sedan. The crisp Ohio night air hit my face, but it did nothing to cool the burning panic in my chest. Once I was inside my car, I locked the doors and let out a breath. I felt like I had been holding for hours. My hands shook so violently that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I drove through the quiet suburban streets of Columbus, away from the hospital, and toward my small apartment, the sheer gravity of what I had seen began to crush me. Petition for emergency medical conservatorship. The bold black letters from that hidden document flashed behind my eyes every time I blinked. They were trying to take away my legal rights. They were trying to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me in a psychiatric facility. But the question that kept hammering in my skull was why? I was a modest bookkeeper. I lived paycheck to paycheck in a beige apartment complex. I had a meager savings account and an old car. I did not have vast wealth or a sprawling estate. There was absolutely no financial incentive to put me under a conservatorship, unless there was something I did not know. Unless there was a financial secret attached to my name that they were desperate to control. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the familiar smell of vanilla and old paper greeted me. It was my safe haven, the only place in the world where my family's toxic reach had never extended. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I walked straight to my small kitchen table, dropped my purse on the floor, and opened my laptop. My hands were still trembling, but a different kind of energy was taking over. The terrified, unloved daughter was fading into the background. The professional bookkeeper was stepping forward. I knew that numbers never lied. People lied constantly. My mother lied with every breath she took. My father lied through his passive silence. Bradley lied to project his wealth. But bank statements, tax records, and credit histories always told the absolute truth. If my family was trying to steal my legal independence, the answer had to be hiding in my financial data. I sat down at the table and opened my web browser. I navigated directly to the official government portal for annual credit reports. I typed in my full name, my current address, my date of birth, and my social security number. The screen prompted me with verification questions to confirm my identity. It asked me about a car loan I had paid off 5 years ago. It asked me to verify a previous address. And then it asked me a question that made my blood run entirely cold. The screen asked me to confirm the monthly mortgage payment on a property located on Elmwood Drive. I stared at the glowing screen. I did not own a property on Elmwood Drive. I had never owned any property in my entire life. I rented my apartment. I clicked the option that said this information does not apply to me. The system processed my answers for what felt like an eternity. The little loading wheel spun around and around, mocking my rising panic. Finally, the page loaded, displaying my complete comprehensive credit report across all 3 major bureaus. I looked at the bold number at the top of the screen. My credit score, which I had painstakingly maintained at an excellent 800 for years, had plummeted to a disastrous 520. My eyes darted down to the summary of open accounts, and all the air left my lungs. According to the official credit bureaus, I was currently holding a staggering $150,000 in debt. I physically recoiled from the laptop, bringing my hands up to cover my mouth as a wave of intense nausea hit me. I could not breathe. The walls of my small apartment felt like they were closing in rapidly. $150,000. It was a completely impossible number. I was meticulous with my finances. I paid my single modest credit card in full every single month. I had no student loans left. I lived a quiet, disciplined life. I forced myself to lean forward and scroll through the detailed breakdown of the fraudulent accounts. My professional instincts kicked in, allowing me to view the disaster through a cold, analytical lens. There were 5 credit cards opened in my name over the last 2 years. Every single one of them was a high-limit premium rewards card. Every single one of them was completely maxed out. The transaction histories were filled with luxury purchases. High-end restaurants, designer clothing boutiques, expensive spa treatments, and massive charges at the very same country club my parents and sister frequented. The cards were barely being paid, showing a history of late fees and minimum payments that were slowly dragging my credit score into the gutter. But the credit cards were only the beginning. Beneath the revolving debt section lay the truly devastating discovery. There were 3 separate mortgages listed under my social security number. They were commercial property loans, highly leveraged and incredibly risky. The properties were listed as small retail spaces in struggling strip malls on the outskirts of Columbus. I clicked into the detailed view of the largest mortgage, searching for any clue, any thread that would explain how this massive fraud had been executed without my knowledge. My eyes scanned the origination details of the loan. The mortgage was not held directly in my name alone. I was listed as the primary guarantor for a limited liability company. The company name was Apex Logistics and Holdings LLC. I did not know the company name, but as a bookkeeper, I knew exactly how to find out who owned it. I opened a new tab on my browser and went straight to the Ohio Secretary of State Business Search Directory. I typed in the LLC name and hit search. The state registry pulled up the official incorporation documents. I scrolled down to the registered agent and the managing director section. The name printed on the state document was Bradley Hartley, my brother-in-law. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the laptop screen casting long, harsh shadows across my dining room. My entire body felt like it was made of lead. The puzzle pieces were no longer scattered on the floor. They had snapped together into a terrifying, crystal-clear picture of absolute betrayal. Bradley was using my pristine credit history and my social security number to secretly fund his failing business ventures and his luxurious lifestyle. My parents had to be in on it. They were the ones who had access to my old tax documents, my birth certificate, and my personal information from when I lived in their house. They had handed my identity over to Bradley to keep his wealthy facade intact. They had let him open credit cards to pay for the designer dresses Jessica wore and the expensive dinners my mother loved to brag about. They had literally mortgaged my future to fund their present. But identity theft was a federal crime. Bradley had forged my signature on commercial real estate documents. He had committed massive bank fraud. If I simply walked into a police station tomorrow morning and handed them this credit report, Bradley would go to federal prison for years. Jessica would lose everything. My parents would be implicated as co-conspirators. Their perfect, pristine country club reputation would be utterly obliterated. And that was exactly why my mother had dropped that crushed pill into my water glass tonight. The horrifying brilliance of their plan hit me with the force of a physical blow. If I discovered the massive debt and went to the police, I would destroy them. But if they managed to drug me and trigger a fake psychiatric emergency, everything would change. If they rushed me to a hospital while I was heavily sedated and confused, they could use Dr. Evans' forged medical evaluation to prove I was suffering from severe paranoid delusions. They would hand the judge that petition for an emergency medical conservatorship. And a person under a legal conservatorship loses all their rights. If they became my legal conservators, I would be considered legally incompetent. I would not be allowed to hire my own lawyer. I would not be allowed to access my own bank accounts. I would not be allowed to sign a contract or leave the state or make my own medical decisions. Most importantly, a legally incompetent person cannot file a police report for identity theft. Their conservator has to do it for them. If my parents won that conservatorship, they would become my legal voice. I would be locked away in a psychiatric ward stripped of my freedom while they quietly took control of my ruined finances. They would simply ignore the fraudulent loans. They would let the properties go into foreclosure, letting the banks eat the losses while completely shielding Bradley from any criminal investigation. My life would be entirely destroyed, buried under a mountain of debt I never created, while they walked away entirely free. The sheer calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. My own mother was willing to poison me at a birthday dinner, label me insane, and lock me in a medical prison just to protect her golden child's husband from the consequences of his own crimes. I was nothing to them. I was not a daughter. I was a credit score. I was a shield. I was collateral damage in their desperate attempt to maintain their hollow, wealthy facade. I closed my laptop, the sudden darkness of the apartment matching the cold, hard rage that was slowly replacing my terror. I had spent 28 years believing that if I was just quiet enough, helpful enough, and accommodating enough, they would eventually love me. I had spent my life cleaning up their messes, hoping for a scrap of genuine affection. But they did not love me. They never had. And now they were trying to bury me alive. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my computer. The frightened, eager-to-please girl was gone. In her place was a woman who realized she had absolutely nothing left to lose. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just the invisible bookkeeper who would blindly drink the water and quietly disappear into a padded room. They had vastly underestimated me. I knew their secrets now. I had the proof of their fraud, and I knew exactly what they were planning to do to me. I was not going to run. I was not going to hide. I was going to find a lawyer, and I was going to burn their entire perfect world right to the ground. I did not sleep for a single second that night. I sat at my small kitchen table as the dark sky outside my window slowly turned the color of bruised iron. I listened to the hum of my cheap desktop printer as it spit out page after page of evidence. I printed the credit reports showing the massive debt. I printed the state registry documents proving my brother-in-law Bradley owned the company that was taking out commercial mortgages in my name. I printed out every single piece of financial data I could find. With every page that landed in the output tray, the terrified invisible daughter I had been for 28 years faded further away. In her place, a cold and calculating bookkeeper emerged. My parents had weaponized my identity to fund their wealthy suburban facade. They had tried to poison me at a dinner table to cover their tracks. Now I was going to need someone who knew how to tear their perfect world apart brick by brick. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in my car in the parking garage of a sleek glass building in downtown Columbus. I had spent the early hours of the morning researching the most aggressive trust and estate attorneys in Ohio. I needed a shark. I needed someone who specialized in family fraud elder abuse, and contested estates. That search led me to David Hastings. His online reputation was terrifying. He was known for dismantling corrupt family dynasties and putting fraudulent conservators behind bars. I walked into his plush mahogany-lined reception area without an appointment. I told his receptionist that I was the victim of a coordinated family identity theft involving commercial real estate and a fraudulent medical proxy. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from David himself. David Hastings was a man in his late 50s, with sharp gray eyes and the calm, unwavering demeanor of someone who had seen the absolute worst of human nature. He did not offer me platitudes or false sympathy. He just sat back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and listened. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I opened my binder and laid out the facts exactly as I would in a corporate audit. I told him about the make-up birthday dinner. I told him about the crushed white pill my mother had dropped into my water glass. I told him about Jessica snatching the drink, her sudden collapse, and the legal folder that had spilled out of her designer handbag. I watched David's eyes narrow as I described the forged psychiatric evaluation and the petition for an emergency medical conservatorship. Finally, I slid the printed credit reports and the business registry documents across his heavy desk. I explained that my brother-in-law Bradley had racked up $150,000 in fraudulent debt under my Social Security number. David reviewed the papers in silence. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a heavy brass clock on his wall. When he finally looked up, his expression was completely unreadable. "They are trying to neutralize you," David said, his voice quiet but incredibly sharp. "If Bradley committed commercial bank fraud using your identity, he is looking at serious federal prison time. If you report this to the police, his entire life is over. By securing a medical conservatorship over you, your parents would gain total legal authority to manage your affairs. You would be deemed legally incompetent. You could not file a police report. You could not hire an attorney. Your parents would simply ignore the debt, let the commercial properties go into foreclosure, and shield Bradley from any criminal investigation. It is a very ruthless, very effective strategy." I nodded, my stomach churning. "So we go to the police right now," I said. "We show them the credit reports. We have Bradley arrested for identity theft. I want them all held accountable." David held up a hand, stopping me. "Hold on, Chloe. Something about this does not add up." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean the evidence is right there?" "The evidence for the identity theft is right there," David corrected, tapping the credit report. "But a fraudulent medical conservatorship requires a massive amount of effort, risk, and upfront legal costs. Bribing a psychiatrist like this Dr. Evans to risk his medical license for a fake evaluation is not cheap. Paying a sleazy lawyer to draft this petition is not cheap. If your parents are as broke as you say they are, if they are drowning in debt and relying on Bradley to fund their country club lifestyle, how are they financing this legal attack against you?" I stared at him completely blank. I had not thought about the cost of the trap itself. David leaned forward, his gray eyes pinning me to my seat. "People do not commit this level of coordinated high-stakes fraud just to cover up bad credit card debt. They do it for a payday. They do it for a massive life-changing amount of cash. Chloe, I need you to think very carefully. Have you ever been the beneficiary of a life insurance policy, a legal settlement, or a family inheritance?" I shook my head immediately. "No, nothing like that. We were always comfortable growing up, but my parents lived way beyond their means. The only person in our family who actually had real wealth was my grandfather, my father's dad. He owned a very successful manufacturing company, but he passed away 5 years ago. My parents told me he left the entire estate to them to help cover their debts and Jessica's wedding." David's eyes flared with a sudden intense recognition. He did not say a word. He just picked up his desk phone, dialed a number from memory, and asked his paralegal to immediately pull the probate records for my grandfather's estate. He told me to sit tight and wait. He walked out of the office, leaving me alone with the ticking brass clock. I sat there for 20 minutes, my mind racing. My grandfather had been the only person in my family who ever truly saw me. He used to take me fishing on the weekends while my parents were busy parading Jessica around at youth pageants. He taught me how to play chess. He praised my grades in school. When he got sick, my parents suddenly restricted my access to him. They claimed he was too weak for visitors. They kept me away during his final months. I had not even been allowed to attend the reading of his will. I had just accepted their story because I was used to being shut out of important family matters. The heavy mahogany door clicked open, and David walked back into the room. He was carrying a fresh stack of legal documents. His face was grim-tight with a mixture of professional anger and deep pity. He sat down heavily in his leather chair and placed the documents right in front of me. "Your parents lied to you, Chloe," David said softly. "They lied to you about everything." He pointed to the top document. It was a certified copy of my grandfather's last will and testament. "Your grandfather knew exactly what kind of people your parents were," David explained, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "He knew they were financially reckless. He knew they favored your sister, and he knew they would eventually bleed themselves dry. He did leave them a portion of his estate. He left them the primary house and a modest cash payout, which I'm guessing they burned through in less than 2 years." David paused, letting that sink in before he delivered the blow that would completely shatter my reality. "But he did not leave them everything. Your grandfather created an ironclad irrevocable trust fund. It contains commercial bonds, high-yield mutual funds, and significant liquid assets. The total value of the trust is slightly over $2 million, and he left it exclusively to you." The air vanished from my lungs. $2 million. I stared at the paper, unable to comprehend the words printed on the page. My grandfather had left me a fortune. He had tried to protect me. He had tried to ensure I would never have to struggle, never have to rely on the people who constantly pushed me aside. "If he left it to me," I stammered, my voice trembling. "Why do I not have it? Why did I never get a single notice about this?" "Because of the stipulations he placed on the trust," David answered, tapping a specific clause on the second page. "Your grandfather wanted to make sure you were mature enough to handle that kind of wealth, and he wanted to make sure your parents could not manipulate you into handing it over to them when you were young. The trust is managed by an independent financial institution out of state. You do not get access to a single dime of that money until the day of your 30th birthday." I did the math instantly. My 30th birthday was exactly 8 months away. "Your parents cannot touch that money," David continued, leaning forward. "Jessica cannot touch it. Bradley cannot touch it. It is legally locked away until you turn 30. But there is a standard legal exception built into almost every trust of this nature." I felt the blood drain from my face as I suddenly understood exactly where this was going. "If the primary beneficiary is declared legally incompetent," David said, confirming my absolute worst fear, "the designated legal conservator gains full fiduciary control over the assets to manage them on the ward's behalf. If your parents successfully petition the court to become your conservators, they gain total unrestricted access to the $2 million. And because they would be the ones filing the annual financial reports to the court, they could easily drain the entire trust to pay off Bradley's fraudulent loans fund, their country club lifestyle, and cover all their hidden debts." The sheer breathtaking evil of their plan washed over me, leaving me entirely numb. The identity theft was just the warm-up. The fraudulent credit cards and the commercial loans were just Bradley using my pristine credit to stay afloat while they waited for the real prize. They had spent the last 2 years plotting to steal $2 million from me. They had invited me to a make-up birthday dinner, not to apologize, but to execute the final phase of their heist. My mother had dropped a powerful psychiatric drug into my water glass so she could watch me collapse, call an ambulance, and use my drugged state as absolute proof that I was violently insane. They were going to lock me in a psychiatric ward, strip away my human rights, and steal the future my grandfather had built for me. They were going to leave me rotting in a medical prison while they spent my inheritance. A hot, blinding rage erupted in my chest. It burned away every last trace of the obedient daughter I had been. "Call the police," I demanded, slamming my hand down on the mahogany desk. "Call the FBI. Call whoever handles this. I want them arrested today. I want my mother in handcuffs. I want Bradley in a federal cell. I want them all to pay for this." David did not reach for his phone. He looked at me with a calm, sobering expression. "We cannot do that, Chloe. Not yet." "Why not?" I shot back, my voice rising. "We have the credit reports. We have the LLC documents. We know what they are trying to do. Because right now, all we have is circumstantial evidence of a conspiracy and solid proof of a white-collar crime committed by Bradley alone, David explained patiently. If you march into a police station today and report the identity theft, your parents will immediately panic. Barbara will burn that medical folder. Dr. Evans will destroy his fake psychiatric evaluation and deny he ever wrote it. Your parents will hire a ruthless defense attorney and claim they had absolutely no idea Bradley was using your identity. They will throw their son-in-law straight under the bus to save themselves. David leaned closer, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. Bradley will go to prison for financial fraud, yes, but your parents will walk away completely free. And more importantly, the attempt on your freedom will never be proven. They will simply regroup, find another way to attack your trust, and spend the rest of your life making you look like a paranoid liar who tore her own family apart over a misunderstanding. I stared at him, the harsh reality of the legal system pouring over me like freezing water. He was right. My mother was a master manipulator. If she had even 5 minutes of warning, she would twist the narrative. She would cry to the police claiming Bradley had fooled them all. She would escape. So how do we stop them? I asked, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. How do we get all of them? To put your mother and father in prison for criminal conspiracy, elder fraud, and attempted medical kidnapping, we need hard, irrefutable proof that they are actively participating in the plot to steal your trust, David said. We need them on tape acknowledging the plan. We need them to actively try to execute that medical proxy in front of witnesses. We need them to hand you the pen and demand that you sign your life away fully, believing they have already won. I swallowed hard, the implications of his words settling heavily in the quiet office. You are telling me I have to go back, I said. David nodded slowly. I am telling you that to nail them to the wall, you have to pack a bag, drive back to that house, and play the perfect, fragile, broken victim they desperately want you to be. You have to willingly walk right back into the lion's den. You have to endure their fake sympathy, navigate their traps, and record every single toxic conversation. It will be the most dangerous psychological game you have ever played. If they realize you know the truth, they might try to drug you again or worse. But if you can hold your nerve, if you can give us exactly 1 week to set a legal trap of our own, I promise you we will destroy their entire world. I looked out the window at the gray Columbus skyline. I thought about the crushed white pill dissolving in the ice. I thought about my mother's fake smile. I thought about my grandfather who had tried to save me, and the $2 million my family was willing to destroy my life to steal. I turned back to David, feeling a chilling sense of absolute resolve settle into my bones. Tell me exactly what I need to do, I said. I left David Hastings' office with a terrifying mission echoing in my mind. I had to convince the very people who were trying to destroy me that their vicious plan was working perfectly. I walked out of the sleek glass building in downtown Columbus and stepped into the damp afternoon air. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a heavy, oppressive gray. I sat in my 10-year-old sedan in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes, just staring at my hands resting on the steering wheel. My knuckles were white. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had spent 28 years making myself small, quiet, and useful so my family would not throw me away again. Now I was about to willingly walk back into the house where they had planned my absolute ruin. I needed to call my mother. I needed to give the performance of a lifetime. I closed my eyes and dug deep into the well of pain I had carried since I was 13 years old. I thought about the night my mother packed my belongings in garbage bags. I thought about the forged psychiatric evaluation sitting in my sister's designer purse. I let the sheer suffocating betrayal wash over me until hot tears actually began to spill down my cheeks. I pinched the bridge of my nose hard, forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. When I felt completely immersed in the role of a broken, unstable woman, I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. It rang twice before she answered. Her voice came through the speaker with that familiar, crisp authority. I did not say hello. I just let out a loud, shuddering sob directly into the receiver. I heard a sharp intake of breath on her end. I told her I was terrified. I made my voice shake, stumbling over my words, as I told her I had not slept a single hour since her dinner party. I confessed that my mind was racing with dark paranoid thoughts, and that I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I played the part of a fragile, crumbling victim so perfectly that it made my own stomach turn. I begged her to let me come home for a few weeks to rest. The silence on the other end of the line was the most chilling thing I have ever experienced. It was not the silence of a worried parent rushing to comfort her child. It was the silence of a predator, watching its prey walk directly into a carefully laid snare. When Barbara finally spoke, her voice dripped with a fake sugary warmth that made my skin crawl. She told me to pack my bags immediately. She said she had been so worried about me and that coming home was the best possible decision I could make. She promised they would take perfect care of me. I thanked her between fake sobs and hung up the phone. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The trap was officially set. Before I went back to my apartment to pack, I drove to a large electronics store 2 towns over. I needed equipment, and I could not risk using a credit card that my family might somehow trace. I walked to the security aisle and purchased 3 high-capacity micro-audio recorders. They were expensive professional-grade devices, no larger than a standard computer flash drive. They were voice-activated, equipped with noise-canceling microphones, and could record for hundreds of hours on a single battery charge. I paid entirely in cash. When I returned to my apartment, I meticulously packed my bags to fit the narrative of a woman giving up on life. I ignored my crisp blouses and professional slacks. I packed only my most worn-out drab clothing: oversized gray sweaters, faded sweatpants, and plain white t-shirts. I wanted to look exactly like the depressed, apathetic ward of the state they needed me to be. I wrapped the tiny recording devices inside a pair of thick wool socks and buried them at the bottom of my suitcase. I drove to my parents' house in the suburbs later that evening. The neighborhood looked as pristine and unwelcoming as ever. Manicured lawns, luxury SUVs parked in wide driveways, and tall oak trees casting long shadows over the sidewalks. My father met me at the front door. Thomas did not hug me. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply grabbed my suitcase from my hand and muttered that my old childhood room was ready. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and poorly concealed anticipation. My mother hovered in the grand foyer, wiping imaginary dust off a console table. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around me. Her expensive perfume filled my nose, smelling strongly of roses and synthetic chemicals. She pulled back and put on a deeply sympathetic frown, inspecting my pale face and oversized sweater. She told me I looked exhausted and directed me upstairs to rest. Walking up those carpeted stairs felt like ascending to a prison cell. I stepped into my old bedroom, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of the twin bed. I took a slow, steadying breath. I was not a victim anymore. I was an investigator gathering the exact evidence I needed for my own survival. I had to plant the recording devices immediately. I knew my parents and my brother-in-law Bradley held their most toxic, revealing conversations late at night, fueled by expensive scotch and their own arrogance. The perfect opportunity came around 10 o'clock that evening. My father retreated to the kitchen to fix his nightly drink, and my mother went upstairs to her master bathroom to run a bath. The downstairs hallway was completely quiet. I slipped out of my bedroom, treading lightly in just my socks, so my footsteps would make absolutely no sound on the hardwood floors. I moved straight into my father's home office. The room smelled of old leather books and the stale smoke of cigars. His massive oak desk sat in the center of the room like a fortress. I pulled one of the micro recorders from my pocket and peeled the backing off the heavy-duty adhesive strip I had attached earlier. I crawled under the heavy wooden desk, my heart hammering loudly in my ears. I reached up blindly, feeling for the wide inner lip of the desk frame. I pressed the device firmly against the rough wood, far out of sight from anyone sitting in the chair. I flipped the tiny switch on the side. A microscopic green light blinked once and went completely dark. The first bug was live. I crept back out into the hallway and moved swiftly toward the formal living room. This was the true center of operations for my family. It was where they gathered with Bradley to drink wine, complain about their debts, and scheme to maintain their wealthy facade. The large mahogany coffee table sat perfectly centered on a plush Persian rug. I could hear the clinking of ice in the kitchen. My father was almost done making his drink. I had seconds to spare. I dropped my pen onto the rug on purpose, knelt down to retrieve it, and swiftly stuck the second recorder deep up into the underside of the coffee table framework. I activated the switch and stood back up just as my father walked into the room carrying a lowball glass of amber liquid. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me. He demanded to know why I was creeping around the dark living room instead of sleeping. I immediately lowered my gaze, wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, and whispered that I was just feeling incredibly anxious and needed a change of scenery. My father scoffed loudly, shook his head in obvious disgust, and turned on the television without saying another word. I shuffled back upstairs to my room. He had absolutely no idea that his entire future was now being quietly recorded from beneath his own furniture. The psychological torture began the very next morning. Jessica arrived bright and early. She had completely recovered from the spiked water she had unknowingly consumed at the dinner party. My mother had apparently brushed off the collapse as a simple fainting spell caused by dehydration, and Jessica had blindly accepted the lie. Now she was back to her arrogant, vain self. She marched into the kitchen wearing a pristine white designer tracksuit, swinging the keys to her luxury SUV around her index finger. I was sitting at the kitchen island wearing my oversized gray hoodie, staring blankly into a bowl of plain oatmeal. Jessica poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned back against the granite counter, looking me up and down with undisguised contempt. She laughed that same sharp, cruel laugh she had used when she snatched the poisoned water from my hand. She told me I looked like a complete disaster. She mocked my supposed mental breakdown, asking if I was finally realizing that I was too weak to survive in the real world. She loudly wondered how I ever managed to hold down a job as a bookkeeper when I clearly belonged in a padded room. She bragged about Bradley closing another massive real estate deal, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was actively being investigated by the FBI for federal embezzlement. Every single insult she threw at me burned like a hot coal. I wanted to stand up, look her in the eye, and scream the absolute truth right in her face. I wanted to tell her she was entirely broke, that her husband was a criminal facing federal prison, and that our parents were going to let her entire life collapse just to save themselves. The urge to destroy her smug expression was almost overwhelming, but I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I kept my head down. I mumbled a pathetic apology and forced a fake tear to slide down my cheek. Jessica smirked, clearly satisfied with her dominance over her broken little sister. She told me to stay out of her way and went upstairs to visit with our mother. I nodded submissively, knowing every cruel word she spoke in this house was just building a stronger, heavier hammer for my attorney to swing. The insults and the mockery were difficult to endure, but they were nothing compared to the nightly routine with my mother. Barbara had proudly appointed herself as my primary caregiver. This meant she controlled everything I consumed in the house. On my second evening there, the true horror of my situation became painfully real. I was sitting on my childhood bed reading a book when the door creaked open. Barbara walked into the room carrying a small paper cup and a tall glass of tap water. Inside the little cup were 2 oval-shaped white pills. I recognized the distinct shape and chalky texture immediately. They looked exactly like the crushed powder she had dumped into my glass at the dinner party. My mother sat down gently on the edge of my bed. Her expression was a masterclass in fake maternal concern. She stroked my hair, her heavy perfume making my stomach roll. She told me she had spoken privately with Dr. Evans, the very same corrupt psychiatrist who had forged my commitment papers. She claimed he had kindly prescribed these mild vitamins and stress relievers to help calm my severe anxiety. She looked at me with those cold blue eyes and told me I needed to take them every single night if I ever wanted to get better. Looking at the woman who gave birth to me, knowing she was actively handing me heavy psychiatric sedatives to build a medical history of mental instability, required every ounce of willpower I possessed. The sheer evil of it was breathtaking. She was smiling at me while handing me the very poison that would lock me in a medical prison forever. I forced myself to smile back. I gave her a weak, immensely grateful look. I thanked her for taking such good care of me when I was so incapable of caring for myself. I took the paper cup with trembling fingers, brought it to my mouth, and tossed the pills inside. I raised the glass of water and pretended to swallow them with a large, dramatic gulp. In reality, I had swiftly tucked the 2 white pills firmly under my tongue. The bitter, chalky taste immediately began to seep into my saliva, making me want to gag. But I kept my mouth closed, smiling softly at my mother. Barbara patted my cheek affectionately, clearly victorious. She took the empty glass from my hands, told me to get some rest, and walked out of the bedroom, closing the door behind her. The second the latch clicked, I lunged toward my bedside table. I spat the partially dissolved pills into my hand and frantically wiped my tongue with a tissue to remove the bitter residue. I wrapped the damp pills carefully in a fresh tissue and hid them deep inside the zippered lining of my suitcase. They were not just pills anymore. They were physical chemical evidence of medical tampering to give to David Hastings and the FBI. I quickly replaced the pills in my daily routine with small white Tic Tacs that I had bought specifically for this purpose. Every night for the next 4 days, my mother would bring me the sedatives. Every night, I would perform the exact same sleight of hand, stashing the real drugs in my suitcase and chewing the mints as soon as she turned her back. I played the part flawlessly. I complained of being tired. I slept for long hours during the day. I moved sluggishly around the house, letting them believe their toxic plan was working perfectly. I endured the fake sympathy, the sneering mockery, and the constant threat of discovery. I was gathering the evidence I needed to ruin them all, and they did not suspect a single thing. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, when the suffocating silence of my childhood bedroom was finally broken. I lay completely still under the faded quilt, the screen of my phone turned all the way down to its lowest brightness setting. I wore a pair of small wireless earbuds, pressing them deep into my ears. For the past 3 nights, I had spent hours listening to the live audio feed transmitting from the hidden micro recorders I had planted under the living room coffee table and inside my father's heavy mahogany desk. Mostly, I had just heard the mundane sounds of a toxic household. I heard my sister complaining about her personal trainer. I heard my mother gossiping maliciously about her friends from church. I heard the television blaring in the background. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air in the house felt heavy, charged with a frantic, nervous energy that kept me wide awake. Through the earpiece connected to the bug in the home office, I heard the heavy wooden door of the study click shut. The lock engaged with a sharp metallic snap. Someone was making sure they would not be disturbed. I held my breath, turning up the volume on my phone. The first sound that came through the feed was the heavy clinking of ice against crystal. Someone was pouring a drink with an unsteady hand. Then I heard pacing. Rapid, heavy footsteps moving back and forth across the hardwood floor, followed by the sound of someone breathing very quickly, almost hyperventilating. "You need to calm down, Bradley," my father said. Thomas sounded annoyed, but there was a distinct edge of fear underneath his usual gruff authority. "Pacing a hole in my rug is not going to fix this. Tell us exactly what happened downtown today." "What happened?" Bradley fired back. His voice was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, slick finance guy who loved to boast about his massive wealth at every family dinner was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate man who sounded like he was on the verge of a total physical collapse. "I will tell you what happened, Thomas. The federal government happened. The FBI showed up at my secondary office unannounced this morning. They walked in with federal warrants and boxed up every single computer, every hard drive, and every physical ledger I have touched in the last 4 years. They completely froze the operating accounts." I sat up in my bed, pulling the blanket tight around my chest. My heart began to pound a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I knew Bradley was a fraud. The credit reports I had pulled days ago proved he was stealing my identity to take out commercial loans. But I had no idea the scope of his crimes had attracted the federal government. "Did they say what they are looking for?" my mother asked. Barbara's voice was sharp, cutting through the panic in the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. She did not sound afraid. She sounded calculating, like a general assessing a battlefield. "They do not need to say it, Barbara," Bradley cried out, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "They know. They have to know. I have been moving money around for 3 years just to keep this entire family afloat. Do you have any idea how much pressure I am under? Jessica spends $10,000 a month on clothes and spa treatments. You and Thomas have not paid your actual mortgage with your own money since I married into this family. I had to create 3 fake limited liability companies just to funnel cash into your checking accounts so you could keep up appearances at the country club." Where do you think all that money came from?" The silence that followed his outburst was incredibly heavy. Even through the tiny microphone hidden under the desk, I could feel the suffocating tension radiating inside that office. "You told us those were profits from your commercial real estate investments," my father said slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerous accusatory whisper. "You looked me in the eye and said your firm was expanding." "I lied," Bradley shouted, the sound of his glass slamming down on the desk, making me flinch in the dark. "I lied to keep you people happy. I embezzled the funds from my clients. I skimmed from the corporate trust accounts I was managing. I took a little at first, just to cover the down payment on the new house for Jessica. But then the market shifted and your debts kept piling up, and Jessica wanted that country club membership. I had to keep taking more to cover the missing balances. And when I ran out of client money, I stole Chloe's identity to open those commercial credit lines. I maxed out everything just to buy us time." I pressed my hand firmly over my mouth to stop myself from letting out a gasp. Hearing the absolute truth spoken aloud was far more horrifying than seeing it printed on a credit report. Bradley had not just stolen my identity to fund a bad business deal. He had stolen millions of dollars from innocent people to fund my parents' entirely fake, luxurious lifestyle. My mother and father had built their pristine, wholly suburban reputation on stolen money. "How much?" my mother asked. Her voice did not waver for a single second. She did not express a single ounce of guilt or moral outrage that her son-in-law was a common thief. She only cared about the survival of her image. "How much is missing from the client accounts, Bradley?" "Give me the exact number." $1.8 million. Bradley choked out. He sounded like he was weeping. "I need at least $1.8 million by the end of the month. If I can replace the missing funds before the federal indictments are formally unsealed, my lawyer thinks he can negotiate a quiet settlement. He thinks he can make the criminal charges go away by claiming it was a massive accounting error and returning the capital. But if I do not have that cash in 2 weeks, the FBI will publicly arrest me. I'm going to federal prison for a decade, Thomas. And when I go down, the feds will trace every single dollar I stole. They will see that the money went into your bank accounts. They will foreclose on your house. They will seize Jessica's cars. You will lose absolutely everything. You will be humiliated in front of everyone in this town." "Do not speak to us about humiliation," my father snapped, slamming his fist against the wall. "You brought this disaster into my home. You married my daughter and turned my family into accomplices to a federal crime. If the people at the church find out about this, if the country club board finds out, we will be completely ruined." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer toxicity of my father's words wash over me. He was not upset that innocent people had lost their life savings. He was not horrified that his son-in-law had stolen my social security number to commit fraud. He was only terrified that his wealthy friends at the country club would realize he was completely broke. He cared more about a golf membership than he cared about the fact that his family was built on a foundation of criminal lies. "Stop it, both of you!" Barbara commanded. Her voice was like a whip cracking in the small room. The crying and the pacing stopped immediately. My mother was taking control. "Panicking is a useless emotion. We are not going to lose the house. We are not going to be humiliated in front of our friends. And Bradley is not going to federal prison." "Barbara, you are not listening to me," Bradley pleaded, his voice completely broken. "We are out of options. The credit cards in Chloe's name are totally maxed out. The commercial loans are defaulting. We have zero cash left. Where are we supposed to magically find $2 million in 14 days? We do not have to find it," my mother said smoothly. "We already have it. It is sitting in a secured trust account waiting for Chloe to turn 30. We just need to accelerate the timeline." A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I pressed the earbuds deeper, completely paralyzed by the absolute lack of emotion in her voice. She was talking about stealing my future, and she sounded like she was discussing what to serve for dinner. "The trust," my father muttered, his voice heavy with doubt. "Barbara, the trust is ironclad. Her grandfather made sure we could not touch a single penny. You know what the estate lawyer said. Unless Chloe is declared entirely incapacitated and we are granted full medical and financial conservatorship by a judge, that money is completely locked away. Which is exactly why Chloe is sleeping down the hall right now. My mother replied, her tone dripping with venom and cruel satisfaction. You two need to look at the big picture. The girl is currently a fragile, weeping mess. She came crawling back here begging for help because she cannot handle her own life. She is already doing half the work for us. But the forged psychiatric evaluation, Bradley stammered nervously. Dr. Evans said he needs a documented medical emergency to justify signing the involuntary commitment papers. He cannot just lock her up because she is crying in her bedroom. If the court looks into this and sees we rushed a conservatorship without a major inciting incident, they will deny the petition. They might even investigate the medical claims. That is why we are going to give them a very public, very undeniable medical incident, Barbara said. I could hear her moving closer to the desk, her footsteps clicking softly on the hardwood. Dr. Evans has already agreed to play his part. He owes me a massive favor from the zoning board dispute last year. He will sign whatever I tell him to sign as long as we provide the proper theatrical cover. What kind of cover? My father asked. The country club anniversary party is next Thursday, my mother explained, laying out her master plan with chilling precision. Half the town will be there. The pastor, the mayor, the local judges, everyone who matters. Chloe will be there playing the role of the unstable, exhausted daughter. Towards the end of the evening, when everyone has had a few drinks and the attention is focused on us, we are going to take her into the private dining room near the back hallway. I stopped breathing entirely. I stared at the blank wall of my dark bedroom, listening to my own mother plot my absolute destruction. We will have the medical proxy and the conservatorship consent form sitting on the table. Barbara continued, her voice cold, deliberate, and utterly devoid of human empathy. We will explain to her that she is clearly unwell. We will tell her she needs serious long-term psychiatric help that she cannot afford on her own. We will demand that she sign the rights over to us so we can manage her care. And what if she refuses? Bradley asked, his voice trembling. What if she realizes what we are doing and tries to walk out? She will not walk out. My mother sneered, a cruel, ugly sound that echoed through the hidden microphone. Because she will not be in any condition to walk anywhere. I will make sure she has a very special cocktail right before we go into that room. Something much stronger than the mild sedative I gave to Jessica by mistake at the birthday dinner. By the time we put the pen in her hand, she will be completely disoriented, terrified, and highly suggestible. If she refuses to sign, she will look like a raving, hysterical lunatic. We will simply open the doors, let all our distinguished guests see her screaming and collapsing in the hallway, and then we will call the paramedics. You want her to have a public meltdown in front of the entire country club? My father asked, sounding genuinely shocked. Not out of concern for me, but out of concern for the public spectacle. Yes, Thomas, Barbara snapped. Because a public meltdown in front of 70 credible witnesses is exactly the documentation Dr. Evans needs to sign the involuntary commitment papers without raising any suspicions. Everyone will see that our poor sick daughter has lost her mind. Everyone will pity us. The ambulance will take her away strapped to a gurney. Dr. Evans will process the paperwork that same night. By Friday morning, she will be legally stripped of her rights and locked in a secure psychiatric ward. And by Friday afternoon, I will walk into the bank with the judge's stamped conservatorship order and seize control of the trust. My mother paused, and I could hear the absolute triumph in her voice. Just force Chloe to sign the medical proxy at the country club anniversary party next week. Dr. Evans will sign the commitment papers. Once she is locked in the ward, the $2 million is ours. We pay off Bradley's stolen funds, we save the house, and we never have to worry about money or that miserable, useless girl ever again. It has to work, Bradley whispered frantically. Barbara, if this fails, if she somehow gets away and talks to a lawyer, we are all going to federal prison. It will not fail, my mother said confidently. Chloe is weak. She has always been weak. She is too desperate for our approval to ever fight back. She will drink whatever I hand her. She will cry and she will disappear exactly like I tell her to. The audio feed went quiet as my mother walked across the study and unlocked the heavy wooden door. I heard their footsteps filter out into the hallway, moving toward their respective bedrooms to sleep soundly, completely untroubled by the fact that they had just finalized a plan to bury me alive. I reached up with trembling fingers and pulled the wireless earbuds out of my ears. I set them down on the nightstand. The silence in my dark bedroom was absolute, but the roaring in my head was deafening. My own mother, my own father, my sister's husband. They had sat in a room directly below me and meticulously planned how to erase my existence. They were going to drug me again. They were going to humiliate me in front of hundreds of people. They were going to lock me in a psychiatric facility where no one would ever hear my voice again. All of it just to steal the inheritance my grandfather had left me. All of it just to save themselves from the consequences of their own criminal greed. I looked down at my hands. They had stopped shaking. The terror that had gripped me for the past week was entirely gone. The scared, invisible daughter who just wanted her family to love her had officially died in this bedroom tonight. What replaced her was a woman forged in pure, freezing anger. I looked at the digital clock glowing on my nightstand. It was 2:45 in the morning. The country club anniversary party was next Thursday. I had a hard, absolute deadline. I had exactly 1 week. 7 days to take the audio recording of their criminal conspiracy and turn it into the ultimate weapon. 7 days to coordinate with David Hastings and the federal authorities. 7 days to build a trap so devastating, so inescapable, that when the doors to that private dining room finally opened, my family would not find a broken victim ready to surrender. They would find their own absolute ruin. I did not wait for the sun to fully rise. By 6 o'clock on Friday morning, I was already walking quietly down the carpeted stairs of my parents' home. I carried my purse tightly against my side, feeling the solid weight of the micro audio recorder safely zipped inside the inner pocket. I left a brief note on the kitchen counter, claiming I had an early morning therapy appointment to manage my severe anxiety. I knew my mother would love that note. It played perfectly into her twisted narrative. I unlocked the front door, stepped out into the crisp Ohio morning air, and drove straight to downtown Columbus. When I walked into David Hastings' office, he took one look at my face and immediately knew something massive had shifted. The fragile, terrified girl who had sat across from him just a few days ago was completely gone. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his heavy mahogany desk, unzipped my purse, and placed the tiny black recording device gently on the polished wood. I told David that I had exactly what we needed. I told him I had captured the entire conspiracy on tape. David connected the device to his computer and opened the audio file. We sat in absolute silence as the recording began to play. The sound of ice clinking against crystal filled the quiet office, followed by Bradley, frantic, hyperventilating panic. I watched David's expression harden, as Bradley confessed to embezzling $1.8 million from his clients. But when the recording reached the part where my mother took control of the conversation, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. We listened to Barbara lay out her meticulous sociopathic plan to drug me at the country club anniversary party, humiliate me in front of 70 witnesses, and use a corrupt psychiatrist to lock me in a medical prison so she could steal my $2 million trust fund. When the audio file finally ended, the silence in the office was deafening. David leaned back in his chair, took off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. He looked at me with a profound, quiet respect. He told me that in 30 years of practicing law, he had seen families do terrible things to one another over money, but he had never seen anything quite as coldly calculated and purely evil as the plan my mother had just outlined. He told me I had done an extraordinary job, but now it was his turn to go to work. We had exactly 6 days until the anniversary party, and we were going to use every single minute of that time to build an impenetrable fortress around my life. The first step was completely cutting off their access to my grandfather's money no matter what happened in Ohio. David explained that even with the audio recording, we could not leave the trust vulnerable. If my mother somehow managed to get a local judge to sign an emergency conservatorship order next week, a local bank might be forced to freeze the assets or hand over control before we could prove the fraud. We had to make the money legally untouchable. David laid out a brilliant financial counterstrike. We were going to legally transfer the entire jurisdiction of the $2 million trust out of Ohio and move it directly to Delaware. As a bookkeeper, I understood exactly why he chose Delaware. It is the absolute gold standard for asset protection in the United States. David explained that we were going to place my inheritance under an ironclad, irrevocable trust structure managed by an independent corporate trustee based in Wilmington. We spent the next 5 hours drafting and signing a mountain of legal paperwork. We wrote incredibly specific language into the new trust documents. David drafted a specialized duress clause. This clause explicitly stated that if any court in any state outside of Delaware ever attempted to declare me legally incompetent, or if any person attempted to assert a medical proxy or conservatorship over me, the Delaware trust would instantly and automatically lock down. The corporate trustee was legally bound to freeze all distributions and deny any access to the funds. It was a financial masterstroke. Even if my mother succeeded in her insane plot, even if she paraded a straitjacket into the country club and got a corrupt judge to sign the papers, it would be completely useless. The moment she tried to take those Ohio court papers to the bank, the Delaware trustee would reject them. The $2 million was locked behind a legal vault that my parents could never, ever breach. Signing my name on those final documents brought tears of profound relief to my eyes. For 28 years, my signature had meant nothing to my family. I was just the invisible daughter, the free help, the scapegoat. Now my signature was the key to my absolute freedom. My grandfather had left me that money to protect me from them, and thanks to David, his final wish was finally secure. But protecting the money was only half the battle. My parents and Bradley had committed severe crimes, and they were actively plotting to strip away my human rights. They needed to pay for what they had done. It was time to bring in the federal government. David made a phone call on a secure line. Less than 2 hours later, the heavy wooden door to the conference room opened and a man in a sharp gray suit walked in. He introduced himself as Special Agent William Carter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in white-collar crime and corporate fraud. He was a tall, imposing man with an intense, analytical gaze. He sat down at the table, opened a plain notebook, and looked directly at me. He did not look at me with pity or doubt. He looked at me like a crucial witness to a major federal crime. It was incredibly validating to finally be taken seriously by someone in a position of authority. I opened my organized binder and slid my evidence across the table. I operated purely on my professional instincts as a bookkeeper. I handed Agent Carter the comprehensive credit reports showing the $150,000 in fraudulent commercial loans and maxed out premium credit cards. I handed him the official state registry documents proving that the shell companies holding that debt were entirely owned and operated by Bradley. I walked him through the financial timeline showing exactly how Bradley had stolen my social security number to secure funding when his own credit ran dry. Agent Carter reviewed the papers methodically. He nodded, confirming that Bradley was already a prime target in a massive ongoing federal investigation regarding missing client funds at his brokerage firm. The identity theft I had uncovered was the exact missing link they needed to prove how Bradley had been hiding his failing margins. Carter told me this evidence alone was enough to guarantee Bradley would be spending a very long time in a federal penitentiary. But then David pushed the laptop forward and told Agent Carter he needed to listen to the audio recording I had captured the night before. I watched Agent Carter's face as he listened to the tape. I watched his professional, detached demeanor crack as he heard Bradley confess to embezzling $1.8 million. I watched his eyes narrow in absolute disgust as my mother outlined her plan to poison me publicly, humiliate me, and bribe a psychiatrist to lock me in a medical prison. When the recording ended, Agent Carter closed his notebook and let out a long, heavy breath. He looked at me and said that my mother was one of the most chillingly pragmatic criminals he had ever encountered. He explained that this was no longer just a white-collar embezzlement case. This was a multi-layered federal conspiracy. It involved identity theft, wire fraud, medical fraud, and a coordinated attempt to execute extortion and unlawful imprisonment. They were going to bring the hammer down on my entire family. But Agent Carter echoed the exact same warning David had given me earlier. He explained the strict legal thresholds of conspiracy. While the audio tape was incredibly damning, defense attorneys could argue it was just a drunken, desperate conversation that they never actually intended to carry out. To guarantee a conviction that would put my parents behind bars for years, the FBI needed the overt act. They needed my mother to actually attempt the extortion. They needed her to put the fraudulent conservatorship papers on a table, hand me a pen, and use the threat of the psychiatric ward to try and steal the $2 million. We had to let them spring the trap. We had to let them think they had won. Agent Carter leaned forward, resting his arms on the conference table. He laid out the strategy with meticulous military precision. The FBI was going to form a joint task force with local authorities to crash the country club anniversary party next Thursday. They would have plainclothes agents embedded among the catering staff and waiting in the parking lot. They would have tactical units ready to secure the building the moment the crime was committed. But everything relied on my performance. Agent Carter told me I would be wearing a highly concealed federal wire. I would have to endure the party. I would have to drink whatever fake non-toxic beverage my mother handed me and pretend to be heavily sedated. I would have to willingly walk into that private back room with my abusers and let them back me into a corner. He promised me that federal agents would be stacked right outside the door, listening to every single word through my wire. The moment my mother made the threat and presented the fraudulent legal documents, I would give a predetermined safe word. The FBI would breach the room and it would all be over. Carter looked at me very seriously. He told me it would be terrifying. He warned me that standing in a closed room with the people who had abused me my entire life pretending to be weak, while they tried to destroy me, would test every psychological limit I had. He told me that if I wanted to back out, they could simply arrest Bradley for the financial crimes today and leave my parents out of it. I thought about the 13-year-old girl sitting on a porch with her life packed into black garbage bags. I thought about the decades of being treated like a disposable burden, the mocking laughter, the stolen credit, and the crushing realization that my mother would gladly bury me alive to save her country club membership. I looked Agent Carter square in the eye. I told him I was not backing out. I told him I wanted to wear the wire. I was going to give them the performance of a lifetime, and I was going to hand the federal government everything they needed to lock my family away. We spent the rest of the afternoon going over the tactical details. Carter instructed me to return to the house and continue playing the sick, compliant daughter. I was to keep taking the fake Tic-Tac pills every night, ensuring my mother believed her conditioning was working perfectly. I had to let Jessica insult me. I had to let my father ignore me. I had to become the ultimate ghost in that house, counting down the hours until Thursday evening. When I finally left David Hastings' office and drove back to the suburbs, the gray clouds over Columbus had begun to break, letting thin rays of sunlight hit the wet pavement. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel a sense of dread as I pulled into my parents' pristine manicured driveway. I walked through the front door and was greeted by the suffocating smell of my mother's perfume and the sound of Jessica complaining loudly about her upcoming dress fitting. My mother rushed over to me, her fake smile plastered across her face, asking how my therapy appointment had gone. I slumped my shoulders, looked at the floor, and whispered that I was just so exhausted and confused. I told her I felt incredibly lucky to have a family looking out for me when I was so incapable of managing my own life. Barbara patted my cheek, her eyes gleaming with absolute predatory victory. She told me to go upstairs and rest, promising that everything was going to be completely taken care of very soon. I walked up the stairs to my childhood bedroom, feeling the cool metal of the spare audio recorder still tucked in my pocket. The financial blockade was set. The legal fortress in Delaware was fully operational. The federal government was preparing their arrest warrants. My family thought they were meticulously building my coffin, completely unaware that they were simply hammering the nails into their own. The country club party was exactly 6 days away, and I was absolutely ready to step into the storm. Thursday evening finally arrived, carrying with it a heavy, humid air that settled over the manicured grounds of the Columbus Country Club. The venue was a sprawling monument to old money and suburban prestige. Vaulted ceilings with exposed mahogany beams stretched over the main ballroom. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 50 circular tables covered in crisp white linen. Waitstaff in perfectly pressed uniforms floated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of seared scallops, imported caviar, and flutes of expensive vintage champagne. It was exactly the kind of lavish, ostentatious display my parents lived for. It was a physical manifestation of their desperate need to prove they belonged among the wealthy elite of our city. As a professional bookkeeper, I could not help but calculate the sheer cost of the room as I walked through the heavy double doors. The prime rib carving station, the towering ice sculpture of 2 swans in the center of the room, the 12-piece string quartet playing softly in the corner, and the premium open bar. It was easily a $50,000 event. The irony was so sharp it almost choked me. I knew exactly how this extravagant 35th wedding anniversary was being funded. Every single hors d'oeuvre, every drop of champagne, and every hour of the string quartet was being charged to a high-limit corporate credit card issued to Apex Logistics. It was being paid for with my stolen identity. My parents and my brother-in-law were throwing the social event of the season, and they were using my ruined credit score to foot the entire bill. I stood near a massive marble pillar at the edge of the ballroom holding a simple glass of plain ice water. I had dressed specifically for the role my mother needed me to play. While the other guests wore vibrant cocktail dresses and tailored tuxedos, I wore a drab, shapeless gray dress that hung loosely on my frame. I wore absolutely no makeup. I had not washed my hair that morning, letting it hang in flat, lifeless strands around my pale face. I let my shoulders slump forward, practicing the shallow, uneven breathing of someone completely overwhelmed by their own anxiety. I made sure to let my eyes drift aimlessly, staring at the floor and avoiding eye contact with anyone who walked past. I looked exactly like a fragile, broken woman, heavily medicated on psychiatric drugs. I looked like a woman who could not possibly defend herself. Across the room, my parents were holding court. Thomas and Barbara looked like royalty holding a grand reception. My mother wore a custom emerald green gown that caught the chandelier light with every step she took. She was laughing, touching the arms of local politicians, and accepting lavish praises from the women in her church circle. My father stood beside her in a sharp black tuxedo, projecting the image of a proud, successful patriarch. They looked so incredibly happy. They looked completely untouched by the fact that they had planned to lock their youngest daughter in a medical prison tonight. Bradley stood near the premium bar, and he did not look happy at all. My brother-in-law was sweating profusely despite the heavy air conditioning in the ballroom. He was on his fourth glass of neat scotch. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes constantly darting toward the main entrance, as if he expected the federal government to kick the doors down at any second. He knew the FBI was actively auditing his firm. He knew he was completely out of time to replace the $1.8 million he had embezzled from his clients. He kept wiping his forehead with a cocktail napkin and shooting desperate, silent glances at my mother. He was counting down the minutes until they could force me into a psychiatric ward and steal my $2 million trust fund to save his miserable life. Then there was Jessica. My older sister was truly in her element. She glided across the ballroom floor in a stunning bright red designer gown that I knew cost at least $3,000. She commanded the room with her usual arrogant charm, posing for photographs and flashing her expensive diamond jewelry. But her main objective for the evening was incredibly clear. She was laying the psychological groundwork for my impending disappearance. I watched silently from my spot by the marble pillar as Jessica approached a group of wealthy older women from my mother's church congregation. I recognized Mrs. Higgins and Mrs. Gable, two women known for spreading gossip faster than a local news station. Jessica smiled sadly at them, placing a delicate hand over her heart. I listened closely as she dramatically lowered her voice, calibrating her volume perfectly so that the surrounding guests could still overhear her tragic tale. Jessica sighed heavily and pointed a manicured finger discreetly in my direction. She told the women that our family was going through an absolute nightmare. She whispered that my mental health had completely collapsed over the past few weeks. She claimed I was suffering from terrifying delusions, that I had become entirely unstable, and that I was currently a danger to myself. She wiped a fake, invisible tear from the corner of her eye and said that our mother had barely slept in days because she was so paralyzed with worry over my fragile condition. She asked the women to please keep our family in their daily prayers because they were preparing to make some very difficult medical decisions to get me the professional help I so desperately needed. Mrs. Higgins gasped, clutching her pearl necklace in shock. Mrs. Gable looked over at me with an expression of profound, sickening pity. They shook their heads sadly, whispering their sympathies to my sister. They praised Jessica for being so strong and commended my parents for being so fiercely dedicated to their sick, broken daughter. It took every single ounce of my professional discipline not to march across the ballroom and scream the absolute truth right into their faces. I wanted to grab my sister by her $3,000 dress and tell the entire country club that her husband was a federal criminal. I wanted to scream that my parents were identity thieves who had stolen my social security number to buy the very shrimp cocktails these women were currently eating. The urge to break my character and defend myself burned like a raging fire in my chest, but I bit the inside of my cheek and remained perfectly still. I kept my gaze fixed blankly on the polished hardwood floor. I let my hand tremble visibly around my water glass. I gave them exactly the pathetic, tragic performance they needed to see. Let them believe I was completely destroyed. Let them build their false narrative. Because hidden beneath my drab gray dress taped firmly against my rib cage was a federal-grade recording device. The tiny wire was warm against my skin. It was currently transmitting every single cruel whisper, every fake tear, and every toxic lie directly to Special Agent Carter and a team of federal agents, waiting inside unmarked vehicles in the country club parking lot. My right hand was buried deep inside the pocket of my oversized cardigan. My fingers were wrapped tightly around my smartphone, my thumb resting gently against the dark screen. Earlier that afternoon, David Hastings had arranged a quiet meeting with the audiovisual manager of the country club. Under the threat of a massive federal subpoena regarding the fraudulent credit card used to book the venue, the manager had been incredibly cooperative. My smartphone was now completely synced to the master control system of the ballroom. Right above the main stage, a massive projector screen was lowered, displaying a continuous looping slideshow of my parents' 35 years of perfect marriage. There were huge photographs of their wedding day pictures, of them smiling on expensive vacations, and images of them holding a young, beaming Jessica. There were no pictures of me. I was entirely erased from their public history exactly as I had been erased from their hearts. But they did not know that my phone controlled that screen. With one single tap of my thumb, that beautiful slideshow would instantly vanish. It would be replaced by high-resolution images of the forged medical proxy, the fraudulent commercial loan applications with Bradley's signature, and the undeniable proof of my stolen identity. I was a walking, breathing bomb, and my family was proudly hosting a party directly on top of the detonator. The large brass clock above the bar moved closer to 9 o'clock. The lavish dinner plates had been cleared away by the waitstaff. The string quartet transitioned into a slow, rhythmic jazz piece. The volume of the room swelled with laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the loud hum of wealthy suburbanites celebrating their own importance. I felt a sudden shift in the energy of the room. It was time. I looked up and saw Barbara excusing herself from a lively conversation with a local judge. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown with slow, deliberate hands. Her eyes locked onto me from across the crowded ballroom. The fake radiant warmth on her face instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, predatory focus. She began walking toward me, weaving through the tables with the grace of a hunter closing in on a trapped animal. I saw Bradley watching her move. He set his empty scotch glass down on the bar and took a deep, shaking breath, nodding slightly to himself. Jessica stopped talking to the church ladies and turned to watch our mother approach me. The trap was finally springing shut. "Chloe, sweetheart," my mother said as she reached my pillar. Her voice was specifically projected to ensure the guests standing nearby could hear her dripping maternal concern. "You look so incredibly exhausted, honey. Your hands are shaking. The noise in the large crowd must be far too much for your poor nerves right now." I blinked slowly, forcing my eyes to look heavy and unfocused. I mumbled a quiet, incoherent agreement, letting my shoulders slump even further forward. Barbara placed a hand on my upper arm. To anyone else in the room, it looked like a mother gently supporting her sick child. But her fingers dug into my flesh with a vicious, unyielding pressure. It was a physical threat, a painful warning disguised as a loving embrace. "Why do we not go find a nice, quiet place to sit down together?" Barbara suggested, her voice sickeningly sweet, but her grip tightening like a vice. "Dr. Evans is here tonight, and he really wants to check your vitals to make sure you are stable. Let us just step into the private dining room in the back hallway for a few minutes. We can get you away from all this overwhelming noise and figure out exactly what you need to get better." She began to pull me away from the marble pillar. I did not resist. I let her guide me through the crowded room. I stumbled slightly on purpose, dragging my feet across the polished floor to sell the illusion that the fake psychiatric drugs were destroying my motor skills. Guests parted ways for us, offering my mother sympathetic smiles and shaking their heads at my disheveled appearance. We walked past the grand buffet table, and I caught Bradley staring at us with wide, desperate eyes. He knew his entire freedom depended on what happened in the next 10 minutes. We left the bright glaring lights and the loud echoing music of the main ballroom. The transition was immediate. The back hallway of the country club was dimly lit by small wall sconces and completely silent. The heavy oak doors at the entrance to the corridor muffled the sounds of the party behind us, cutting us off from the rest of the world. At the very end of the long carpeted hallway was the private dining room. The heavy wooden door was pushed slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening, I could see the polished surface of a long conference table. I knew exactly who was waiting inside that room. I knew my father was sitting there ready to act as the concerned, heartbroken witness. I knew the corrupt Dr. Evans was standing by with his forged involuntary commitment papers ready to sign away my freedom for a zoning board favor. And I knew the medical proxy documents were sitting on that table waiting for my signature to hand over $2 million. My mother's manicured fingernails dug deeper into my arm as she marched me down the silent corridor. She was breathing heavily now, fueled by the adrenaline of her impending victory. She truly believed she had won. She believed I was nothing but a weak, medicated ghost about to be locked in a cage and forgotten forever. The wire taped firmly against my chest felt like a plate of solid armor. My thumb traced the edge of the smartphone hidden deep in my pocket. Every single step we took down that dark hallway was a step closer to the end of their lives. I kept my head bowed, staring at the intricate floral pattern of the carpet beneath my feet, and I stepped willingly into the storm. The heavy oak door of the private dining room clicked shut behind us, sealing us off from the lively music and the clinking champagne glasses of the main ballroom. The sudden silence was absolute and suffocating. The air in this room felt thick, entirely different from the cool, air-conditioned elegance of the hallway we had just left. The room was sparsely decorated, featuring dark mahogany-paneled walls, thick velvet drapes pulled tightly across the windows, and a single long conference table polished to a mirror shine. It smelled faintly of lemon pledge and expensive floor wax, a sterile scent that perfectly matched the cold, calculated nature of the trap I had just walked into. It felt exactly like what it was intended to be. A perfectly constructed cage designed to permanently strip away my freedom, my legal rights, and my future. My mother let go of my arm the second the door was closed. The fake maternal warmth vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a cold, businesslike efficiency that made my stomach turn. She did not offer me a chair. She did not ask me if I needed a glass of water. She simply walked around to the far side of the massive table and took her place standing next to my father. Thomas was already there, arms crossed over his sharp black tuxedo, shifting his weight uncomfortably from side to side. He refused to meet my eyes. He looked down at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug, perfectly playing his role. As the passive, complicit coward he had always been throughout my entire life. But they were not alone in the room. Standing at the head of the long wooden table was a man I recognized from the forged documents I had discovered a week ago. Dr. Evans. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that screamed of quiet, corrupt wealth. He held a thick leather briefcase in one hand and a heavy gold-plated pen in the other. He gave me a brief clinical smile that did not reach his cold, dead eyes. He looked at me not as a patient in need of care, not as a human being experiencing a crisis, but as a simple financial transaction. I was nothing more than the final hurdle between him and whatever massive political or financial favor my mother had promised him, in return for his signature on my involuntary commitment papers. I stood near the door, keeping my shoulders slumped, my breathing shallow and my eyes darting nervously around the room. I had to maintain the illusion that I was a heavily medicated, mentally unstable woman, on the verge of a total psychological collapse. The wireless transmitter taped tightly against my ribcage was warm, a steady, comforting reminder that I was not truly alone in this room. Special Agent Carter and his team of federal agents were parked just outside the building, listening to every single breath, every rustle of fabric, and every word spoken inside this mahogany cage. All I had to do was hold my ground and guide my family into making their extortion completely explicit. My mother reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. It was the exact same folder that had spilled onto the dining room rug the night she tried to drug my water. She placed it onto the polished surface of the table with a soft, heavy thud and slid it across the wood until it rested just inches from my trembling hands. She opened the folder and smoothed the top pages flat. Even upside down, I could clearly read the bold, terrifying legal headings printed at the top of the documents. petition for emergency medical conservatorship, general power of attorney, revocable proxy consent. These were the chains they had forged for me. These were the documents that would grant Barbara and Thomas total irrevocable control over my health, my physical location, and my hidden $2 million trust fund. They would gain the legal authority to drain my grandfather's money, pay off Bradley's massive federal embezzlement debts, and save their pathetic hollow country club facade from public ruin. Dr. Evans stepped forward, placing his gold-plated pen directly on top of the signature line. He cleared his throat, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and spoke in a soft, patronizing tone that made my blood run entirely cold. He told me that he had been reviewing my behavioral patterns and consulting extensively with my deeply concerned parents over the past few weeks. He claimed that my recent episodes of severe anxiety, my lethargy, my social withdrawal, and my supposed paranoia were clear, undeniable indicators of a rapid-onset psychotic break. He said he was incredibly concerned for my immediate physical safety. He stated that I lacked the cognitive capacity to make rational decisions for my own well-being. He lied with such effortless fluency and absolute conviction that I briefly marveled at how easy it must be for corrupt men to destroy innocent people for profit. My mother walked around the table and stopped just a few feet away from me. She clasped her hands together in front of her emerald green gown and tilted her head, pouring every ounce of her practiced manipulative charm into her voice. She told me that she loved me so much. She told me that it completely broke her heart to see her youngest daughter struggling with such a heavy mental burden. She said that our family had always been my greatest support system, that they would never abandon me, and that they only wanted what was best for my long-term health and happiness. "Sign it, sweetie," Barbara said smoothly. Her voice was like liquid poison pouring directly into my ears, sweet but absolutely deadly. "We just want to protect you from yourself. You are sick, Chloe, and you need our help. We have arranged for you to stay at a beautiful private residential facility just outside the city where you can get the 24-hour professional care you so desperately need. Dr. Evans has secured a private room for you starting tonight. You will not have to worry about paying your bills or managing your apartment or making any difficult choices ever again. Your father and I will take over your finances. We will take care of absolutely everything for you. All you have to do is pick up that pen, sign your name right on that line, and all the pain and confusion will finally stop." I stared at the gold pen resting on the table. I thought about the 28 years I had spent trying to earn her love. I thought about the holidays where I was ignored, the academic accomplishments they dismissed, and the constant suffocating feeling that I was nothing more than an inconvenient burden to their perfect family image. I had bent myself into 1,000 different shapes trying to please them. I had washed their dishes, celebrated my sister's vanity, and faded into the background so they could shine. And now they were asking me to sign my own life away. They wanted me to voluntarily walk into a psychiatric ward, let the heavy metal door lock behind me, and disappear forever. They believed I was completely unaware that I was handing over a $2 million fortune to the very people who were throwing me away like garbage. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean air fill my lungs. I slowly raised my head. I let my shoulders pull back, dropping the slumped, defeated posture I had held all evening. I planted my feet firmly on the intricate pattern of the carpet. I looked directly into my mother's bright blue eyes, and for the first time in my entire life, I did not try to hide the absolute clarity, the burning anger, and the undeniable strength I felt inside my own skin. "No," I said. The word was quiet, steady, and perfectly articulated, but it rang through the mahogany room like a gunshot. My mother blinked rapidly, momentarily, confused by the sudden sharp change in my tone. The fragile, broken girl she had brought into this room had just vanished. She took a half step toward me, reaching her manicured hand out, as if to physically guide my fingers to the pen. "Chloe, honey, I know you are confused right now. The medication makes it hard to think clearly. You do not know what you are saying. Just pick up the pen and sign the paper." "I did not take the medication, Mom," I replied, my voice growing stronger, harder, and completely steady. "I spat your little white pills into my hand every single night. I hid them in my suitcase. I have not taken a single sedative since the night you tried to poison my water glass at the dinner party. I know exactly what you are doing. I know about Dr. Evans and his forged medical evaluation. I know about the commercial real estate debt Bradley recklessly racked up under my social security number to hide his massive corporate embezzlement. And I know about the $2 million trust fund Grandpa left exclusively for me. I am not signing those papers. I am not giving you my money to save Bradley from federal prison. And I am never letting you or Thomas control a single aspect of my life ever again. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. The carefully constructed illusion of the loving, concerned family evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing but raw, ugly desperation and panic behind. Dr. Evans took a rapid, stumbling step backward, his face draining of all color as he realized his criminal involvement in a fraudulent commitment scheme was suddenly entirely exposed. My father gripped the thick edge of the conference table, his knuckles turning stark white as he stared at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked, breathless sound came out. But my mother did not retreat. Barbara's loving maternal facade completely shattered, breaking into a million jagged pieces of pure, unadulterated venom. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The polite, soft-spoken society matron vanished completely, replaced by the vicious, calculating monster she had always been beneath the surface. The woman who viewed me only as an asset to be liquidated was finally revealing her true face. She slammed her hands down hard on the polished wood of the table, leaning forward with her teeth bared. She screamed at me. Her voice was completely unrecognizable, harsh, guttural, and vibrating with absolute hatred. She told me I was a worthless, ungrateful burden. She screamed that they had fed me, clothed me, and put up with my pathetic, boring, invisible existence for 28 years. And that I owed them this money for everything they had sacrificed. She shrieked that my grandfather was a senile, stupid old fool for leaving a massive fortune to a useless, unimpressive bookkeeper, instead of the people who actually deserved to maintain their elite social standing. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face, her emerald dress heaving with her rapid, furious breaths. "You think you can walk out of here and ruin us?" Barbara hissed, her eyes wide, with a manic, terrifying intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You think anyone in this building is going to believe a single word you say? You are nothing, Chloe. You are a nobody. You have no money, no power, and no friends. Dr. Evans is standing right here. He is a respected, highly credentialed medical professional in this community. He will swear under oath that you are suffering from severe, violent delusions. We have 70 people out in that ballroom who just heard your own sister talking about how mentally unstable and dangerous you are. If you try to walk out that door right now, we will tell them you had a massive psychotic break. We will call the paramedics. We will have you dragged out of this prestigious country club in a straitjacket while everyone watches. You will spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a padded room, heavily medicated against your will, until your brain turns to absolute mush." She picked up the heavy gold pen and threw it violently across the table. It clattered loudly against the wood, sliding to a halt right in front of my hands. "Sign the damn papers, Chloe!" she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute frantic desperation. "Sign them right now, or I swear to God I will call the police and have them drag you away." This was the moment. This was the exact, undeniable, overt act of criminal extortion that Special Agent Carter had told me to wait for. She had explicitly threatened me with unlawful imprisonment. She had explicitly demanded my signature under severe duress. She had confessed to the entire fraudulent scheme, the bribery, the fake diagnosis, and the threat of forced medical confinement right into the high-definition federal wiretaped securely to my chest. They had meticulously dug their own graves, built their own coffins, and they had just proudly jumped right inside. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not feel a single ounce of fear, intimidation, or sorrow. The little girl who used to cry alone in her bedroom because her mother did not love her was completely, permanently gone. In her place stood a strong, fiercely independent woman who knew exactly what she was worth and who knew exactly how to execute absolute justice. I looked at my mother, feeling a profound, absolute sense of calm peace wash over my entire body. I looked her dead in the eye and I smiled. It was not a small, nervous smile. It was a wide, genuine, victorious smile that made the blood drain entirely from her enraged, screaming face. I saw the very first flicker of doubt cross her eyes, as she realized I was not reacting the way a trapped victim should react. "You want to call the police?" "Mom," I asked smoothly, letting the words hang heavily in the thick air of the private dining room. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, toward the heavy oak doors, never breaking eye contact with the woman who had tried to destroy me. "What a coincidence," I said, my voice echoing clearly and firmly through the quiet room. "They are already waiting outside." I turned my back on the three people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the private dining room door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. Behind me, I could hear the sudden frantic shuffling of feet, and my father stammering in a panicked whisper. I did not look back. I walked down the corridor with a steady, confident stride. The music from the main ballroom grew louder with every step. The jazz band was playing a lively, upbeat tune, completely unaware of the absolute destruction that was about to unfold. Waitstaff were weaving through the tables, pouring expensive vintage champagne for the final toast of the evening. I walked straight through the heavy oak double doors and back into the dazzling, blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. I bypassed the crowded tables of my parents' wealthy friends. I ignored the confused looks from the women in my mother's church circle, who had just spent the last hour pitying my fragile mental state. I walked purposefully toward the grand stage at the front of the room. The 12-piece string quartet had taken a break, and a small jazz ensemble was currently keeping the guests entertained. I stepped onto the elevated platform. My drab gray oversized dress stood out in stark, ugly contrast to the glittering sea of tailored tuxedos and expensive designer gowns. I walked directly to the lead singer and gently but firmly took the microphone from his hand. He looked completely startled, his eyes widening in confusion, but he stepped back without saying a word. I stood in the exact center of the stage. The massive projector screen behind me was still looping high-resolution photographs of Barbara and Thomas smiling radiantly on their various luxury vacations. I held the microphone up to my mouth. I asked for everyone's attention. My voice echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system, instantly cutting through the polite chatter and the clinking of crystal glasses. The jazz band stopped playing completely. The ballroom fell into a sudden hushed silence. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage. I saw the pastor of my parents' church sitting at a front table looking up at me with a polite, puzzled smile. I saw the local judge and the mayor sitting nearby. Everyone simply stared at me, waiting to hear what the tragically unstable daughter was going to say. I took my smartphone out of the pocket of my oversized cardigan. I looked out at the massive crowd and told them that my parents had brought them all here tonight to celebrate 35 years of a perfect marriage, a perfect home, and a perfect family. I said it was a beautiful, heartwarming story, but it was entirely fake. I told them that the food they were eating and the champagne they were drinking had been purchased with a stolen credit card. I told them it was finally time they saw exactly who Thomas and Barbara really were behind closed doors. I pressed my thumb against the screen of my phone. Instantly, the romantic glowing slideshow on the massive projector behind me vanished. In its place, a bright, undeniable image of a commercial loan application appeared. It was 50 feet wide. Bradley's forged signature was clearly visible right next to my stolen Social Security number. Low murmurs of confusion began to ripple through the wealthy crowd. People were squinting, trying to read the legal jargon on the screen. I tapped the screen again. The image changed to the fraudulent medical proxy and the petition for emergency medical conservatorship. I explained into the microphone, my voice absolutely unwavering, that my brother-in-law Bradley had embezzled nearly $2 million from his corporate clients and stolen my identity to cover his massive financial tracks. I told them that instead of holding him accountable, my loving, devoted parents had decided to drug me at a family dinner bribe, a corrupt psychiatrist to forge a medical evaluation and lock me in a psychiatric ward, so they could steal my hidden inheritance to pay off Bradley's federal crimes and save their precious country club reputation. The crowd gasped loudly. People began whispering frantically to one another, pointing at the screen and shaking their heads in disbelief. But I was not finished. The visual evidence was damning, but the verbal confession was what would truly destroy them. I tapped my phone one last time. The audio file I had recorded from the hidden microphone in my father's study began to play. The sound of my mother's cold, calculating voice blasted through the ballroom speakers with crystal clear precision. Everyone in the room heard Barbara state that I was a fragile, weeping mess. Everyone heard her explicitly outline her plan to slip me a strong chemical cocktail, to make me look like a raving lunatic in front of the entire country club. Everyone heard her sociopathic threat to have me dragged out of the building in a straitjacket if I refused to sign away my legal rights. And most devastatingly, everyone heard her gleefully confirm that once I was securely locked in a medical prison, the $2 million would be theirs to pay off Bradley's stolen funds and save their pristine suburban house. The reaction inside the country club was absolute pandemonium. The horrible, undeniable truth was echoing off the vaulted mahogany ceilings for the entire world to hear. The polite, wealthy society of Columbus sat in stunned, horrified silence. The pastor looked physically sick, pressing his hand over his mouth. Mrs. Higgins, the woman who had just been praying for my mental health, dropped her expensive champagne flute onto the hardwood floor, where it shattered into a dozen glittering pieces. Then the doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. Jessica ran in wearing her $3,000 red designer dress. Her face was contorted in sheer, unadulterated panic. She screamed at the top of her lungs for someone to cut the power to the projector. She shrieked for the sound system to be turned off immediately. She ran toward the stage, waving her arms like a maniac, but nobody moved to help her. The waitstaff stood frozen. The guests just stared at her in absolute disgust. Behind Jessica, my mother and father emerged from the back hallway looking like terrified ghosts. They had heard the audio playing from the main room. They knew exactly what was happening. Barbara's perfect emerald gown seemed to hang heavily on her suddenly frail frame. She looked out at the sea of her closest friends, her fellow charity board members, and her elite neighbors, and she saw nothing but utter revulsion in their eyes. The carefully constructed facade she had spent 35 years building had literally gone up in flames in less than 2 minutes. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the country club suddenly swung wide open, hitting the walls with a loud, echoing bang. Special Agent Carter marched into the ballroom holding up his federal badge. He was followed by a dozen federal agents and local police officers wearing dark tactical vests. The sheer, overwhelming authority of their presence instantly silenced Jessica's hysterical screaming. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Carter did not hesitate. He pointed directly at Bradley, who was standing frozen near the premium open bar. Bradley's face had gone the color of wet ash. His hand shook so violently that he dropped his glass of scotch, the amber liquid spilling across his expensive leather shoes. Federal agents surrounded him instantly, grabbing his arms, pulling them roughly behind his back, and snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. Bradley began to sob loudly, begging the agents to listen to him, claiming it was all a massive misunderstanding. Carter then turned his attention to the back of the room, where my parents were standing paralyzed in the aisle. 2 local police officers approached my father, pulling his arms behind his tailored black tuxedo. Thomas did not fight back. He did not yell or try to defend his family. He just lowered his head, staring at the floor, and began to weep silently as the handcuffs clicked into place. He was a coward until the very bitter end. But my mother tried to pull her usual routine. Even with federal agents walking toward her, Barbara straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and tried to put on a mask of dignified, righteous outrage. She loudly demanded to know what was going on, claiming this was an illegal harassment campaign, and threatening to sue the entire police department for ruining her anniversary party. She turned to the crowd, begging the local judge to intervene. A female federal agent simply grabbed Barbara's arm, spun her around, and handcuffed her right there in front of the mayor, the pastor, and her entire church congregation. The humiliating, sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom. Barbara looked frantically toward her wealthy friends, pleading with them for help, screaming that I had set them up. But the people she had spent her entire life trying to impress simply turned their backs on her. People averted their eyes, whispering in disgusted, hushed tones. The grand illusion was completely destroyed, and Barbara was finally exposed for the monster she truly was. I stood on the stage and watched the FBI escort my parents and my brother-in-law out of the country club. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the large windows of the ballroom, casting eerie shadows across the silent crowd. Dr. Evans was arrested 5 minutes later, caught by local police officers as he tried to sneak out through the kitchen service entrance with his briefcase full of forged medical documents. He would lose his medical license and face years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. Jessica was left standing completely alone in the middle of the ballroom. She was weeping hysterically, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. The reality of her new life was rapidly setting in. Her husband was going to federal prison. The government would seize her house, her luxury vehicles, and every single asset she claimed to own to pay back the embezzled client funds. She had no money, no husband, and no perfect family left to fall back on. I looked at her one last time, feeling absolutely no pity. She had laughed while I was being poisoned. Now she would have to learn how to survive in the real world without anyone to exploit. I handed the microphone back to the bewildered jazz singer. I stepped down from the stage, walked through the parted crowd of stunned guests, and exited the building through a side door. I stepped out into the cool, crisp night air, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest since I was a little girl was finally permanently gone. I walked toward my 10-year-old sedan, smiling as I pulled my car keys from my pocket. I was 28 years old. I had a $2 million trust fund completely protected in a Delaware vault, a brilliant lawyer on my side, and an entirely new, beautiful life ahead of me. I was finally free. If you are watching this, and you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, if you have ever been made to feel like you are invisible, worthless, or a burden just to protect someone else's fragile ego or toxic secrets, I want you to hear this loud and clear. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into their twisted narrative. You do not owe toxic people your silence, your loyalty, or your future, even if they share your blood. You have the absolute right to set boundaries, to demand respect, and to walk away from anyone who tries to diminish your light. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or the courage to stand up for yourself, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and healing. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on how I handled my family. Tell me where you are watching from today and what time it is there. I love connecting with people who understand what it means to fight back. Remember that your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it. Take care of yourself. Choose your own path and never let anyone tell you that you are not enough, because you absolutely deserve the best life has to offer. 6 months have passed since that humid night at the Columbus Country Club. Time is a funny thing when you are finally free. The days no longer feel like a heavy burden pressing down on my chest. Instead, they feel light and full of genuine promise. I wake up every morning and look out the window of my new home, knowing that I am entirely safe. The massive storm that had threatened to destroy my future has finally passed, leaving a beautifully clear sky in its wake. But for my family, the storm was only just beginning. The federal government moves with a slow but absolutely devastating precision. Once Special Agent Carter and his team seized Bradley and his corporate hard drives, the entire fraudulent empire completely unraveled. Bradley tried to negotiate. He tried to offer up his associates and beg for leniency, but the evidence against him was far too overwhelming. The prosecutors meticulously traced every single dollar he had embezzled from his clients. They found the offshore accounts, the fake vendors, and the massive trail of corporate deceit. 2 months ago, I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom and watched Bradley weep like a child as the judge handed down his sentence. He received 8 years in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. His expensive tailored suits and his arrogant country club smirk were permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. But Bradley was only the first domino to fall. My parents, Barbara and Thomas, quickly realized that their pristine suburban reputation could not protect them from federal indictments. The audio recording I had captured in my father's home office became the absolute cornerstone of the prosecution case against them. They were formally charged with identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The very same legal system they had tried to weaponize against me was now holding them entirely accountable. The social fallout was exactly what Barbara had always feared most. The local news stations picked up the story of the wealthy suburban couple who plotted to lock their own daughter in a psychiatric ward to steal her inheritance. The scandal completely rocked their elite social circles. The country club immediately revoked their membership, citing a zero-tolerance policy for criminal behavior. The women from her church congregation, the same women who had pitied my supposed mental breakdown, completely cut all ties with my mother. People crossed the street to avoid her. She became a total pariah in the very town she had spent 35 years trying to impress. Their financial ruin was even more complete. Because Bradley had used their bank accounts to hide his stolen funds, the federal government froze all of my parents' assets. The massive suburban house with the mahogany dining room where they had plotted my demise was seized and foreclosed upon by the bank. I actually drove past the neighborhood on the day they were evicted. I parked down the street and watched as strangers carried Barbara expensive antique furniture out to a moving truck. My father looked broken, pacing the driveway with his head bowed while my mother stood on the lawn looking completely hollow. They are currently out on bail, waiting for their own sentencing hearing next month. David Hastings assures me they are looking at several years behind bars. I feel absolutely no pity for them. They built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and gravity simply did what gravity always does. And then there is Jessica. My golden sister experienced the harshest reality check of all. When Bradley was arrested, the government seized everything they owned to pay back the victims of his embezzlement. The luxury vehicles, the expensive jewelry, and the massive house were all auctioned off. Jessica was left with absolutely nothing. She had never worked a single day in her life. She had no college degree, no professional skills, and no wealthy husband to fund her lavish lifestyle. She was forced to pack a few remaining suitcases and move into a tiny rundown apartment complex on the industrial side of the city. For the first few weeks, she tried to pretend everything was fine. But reality quickly set in. Without our parents to bail her out, she had to find a job working minimum wage at a local retail store. The woman who used to mock my sensible clothes and brag about her $3,000 dresses was now standing on her feet for 8 hours a day folding discounted shirts. Last week, my phone buzzed with a long, frantic text message from her. She begged me for a loan. She said she could not afford her rent and that the stress was destroying her. She told me we were still sisters and that family should always help family in times of crisis. She actually dared to use the word family after watching my mother try to poison me. I read the message twice. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of sadness for the sister I never really had. But then I remembered her cruel laughter in the kitchen. I remembered her telling her friends that I was dangerously unstable. So I did not reply. I did not send her a single dime. I simply blocked her number and went back to my beautiful morning. I am no longer the family safety net. I am no longer the invisible bookkeeper forced to clean up their toxic messes. Speaking of my new life, it is more wonderful than I ever could have imagined. My 30th birthday finally arrived. There was no fake makeup dinner. There was no poisoned water glass. I spent the morning in Delaware sitting in a bright, sunny conference room with the corporate trustees my grandfather had selected. I signed the final release documents, and the $2 million trust was officially transferred into my full control. My grandfather had built that fortune to protect me, and I fully intend to honor his legacy. I used a small portion of the money to completely pay off the fraudulent credit card debt Bradley had opened in my name. David Hastings helped me file the necessary fraud affidavits with the credit bureaus, and my pristine credit score was entirely restored. Then I left my small beige apartment behind forever. I bought a beautiful historic brick house in a quiet tree-lined neighborhood. It has a wraparound porch, a massive kitchen filled with natural light, and a huge backyard where I spend my weekends planting roses and hydrangeas. It is a home built on truth, safety, and absolute peace. But I did not just buy a house and retire. The ordeal with my family ignited a fierce passion inside me. I realized that my professional skills as a bookkeeper, combined with my deeply personal understanding of financial abuse, gave me a unique opportunity to help others. I officially quit my old job and used my inheritance to open my own independent financial consulting firm. My firm is specifically dedicated to helping victims of familial financial abuse. I work with young adults whose parents have ruined their credit. I help elderly clients untangle their assets from greedy relatives. I sit down with people who feel trapped, invisible, and completely overwhelmed by the fraudulent chains their families have wrapped around them. I show them how to track the hidden money how to freeze compromised accounts, and how to legally take their power back. I partner with aggressive lawyers like David Hastings to ensure that financial abusers face real, devastating consequences. Every time I help a client walk out of my office with their head held high, I feel like I'm taking another piece of my own power back. I'm taking the worst thing that ever happened to me and turning it into a shield for someone else. I am 30 years old now. I am strong. I am wealthy. And most importantly, I am entirely free. The people who tried to break me are now living in the exact hell they tried to build for me. They wanted to lock me in a prison so they could live in luxury. Now they are heading to actual prison while I am living the exact beautiful life I always deserved. I have learned that blood does not automatically mean family. True family is about respect, trust, and protecting the people you care about. If someone in your life is using you, draining your resources, or making you feel like a burden to serve their own selfish needs, you owe them absolutely nothing. Setting strong, firm boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is an act of basic survival. You are completely allowed to walk away from toxic people even if you have known them your entire life. You do not need to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. If you are watching this, and you have ever found the courage to stand up to toxic family members, or if you have ever successfully taken your life back from people who tried to control you, I want to hear from you. Please share your story in the comments below. Let us build a community of people who refuse to be victims. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these important stories of justice and healing. Do not forget to tell me what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. Thank you so much for being here with me until the very end. Always remember that your worth is not defined by the people who failed to appreciate you. Take care of yourself and choose your own happiness every single day. I want to take a moment to look right at you and talk about what all of this really means. I spent 28 years of my life thinking that love meant letting myself be used. I thought that if I just stayed quiet, if I just made myself smaller and accommodated every single demand my family made, they would eventually see my worth. I believed that family was supposed to be a safe harbor. But I learned the hard way that blood does not excuse toxic behavior, and you never owe your future to people who actively try to destroy it. When you are raised to be the invisible child, the one who cleans up the messes and takes the blame, you start to internalize that role. You start to believe that you do not deserve the grand life or the big dreams. You believe the lies they tell you about your own fragility. They wanted me to believe I was broken so they could break into my trust fund. They almost succeeded because they relied on my silence. They banked on the fact that I was too eager to please to ever stand up and fight back. But here is the truth that changed my entire life. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. It does not matter if those people are your parents, your siblings, or your friends. If someone looks at you and sees only an asset to be liquidated or a shield for their own crimes, they do not love you. They are using you. Walking away from these people who raised you is the hardest thing you will ever do. It goes against everything society tells us about family loyalty. But loyalty should never be a one-way street paved with your own sanity and financial ruin. Setting boundaries is not an act of revenge. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. I had to let go of the family I desperately wanted so I could finally embrace the beautiful, peaceful life I actually deserved. Now I want to turn this over to you. Have you ever had to stand up to the people who were supposed to protect you? Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family, the one they tried to keep down just so they could feel taller? I know. I am not the only one who has walked this difficult path. Drop a comment below and tell me your story. I read every single one of them, and I know your experiences can help someone else who is currently sitting in the dark, wondering if they have the strength to fight back. While you are down there, let me know where you are watching from today and what time it is. I love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with this amazing community we are building together. If my journey resonated with you, if it gave you even a small spark of hope or validation, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so we can keep sharing these important stories of justice and healing. Always remember, you have the power to write your own ending. Nobody else gets to hold the pen to your life story. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Stay strong, stay safe, and I will see you next time.